Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The air hit different that day. Warm for early spring in Rockland, Pennsylvania. The kind of unexpected heat that makes teenage boys with nothing to do think about adventure. It was 1999, and life moved slow in our backwoods town. My name's Ken Mitchell. Back then, I was 17, restless, and thought I knew everything worth knowing about these woods. I remember the dashboard clock in Dusty's Jeep Cherokee showed 2:18 p.m. when we pulled off Rockland Road onto the dirt path leading toward the old railroad tunnel. Dusty Hanson had been my best friend since third grade. His dad bought him that Jeep for his birthday, forest green with mud-caked wheel wells and a lift kit that gave us enough clearance to go places most folks couldn't reach. "You sure about this, Ken?" Dusty asked, squinting through the windshield at the overgrown path ahead. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel. "Heard weird shit happens at that tunnel," I laughed. "Like what, ghost trains?" "Nuh-uh, man. Bobby Wilkins and them came out here last month. Said they found these massive logs inside, like arranged in some pattern. Nobody could figure how they got there." "Probably just some high school kids messing around," I said. The Jeep jostled as we navigated deeper into the woods. Rockland Woodhill Tunnel wasn't on any tourist maps. Half-mile-long abandoned railroad passage carved right through solid rock, sitting near the old iron furnaces and Freedom Falls. Local history, forgotten by most folks who didn't grow up around here. Trees thinned as we approached the tunnel entrance. Moss-covered stone formed an arch about 15 feet high, water dripping steadily from the ceiling just inside. The forest had started reclaiming the rails long ago, but you could still make out where they once ran. "There it is," I said, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. The tunnel mouth gaped open like a black hole, swallowing the daylight. Dusty parked the Jeep facing the entrance. We both stared into the darkness. Even with the sun high above us, we couldn't see more than 20 feet inside. "Got a flashlight?" Dusty asked. I pulled one from my backpack. "Always prepared." "Boy Scout bullshit," he laughed, but I saw the relief on his face. Dusty shifted into drive, and we crept forward. The Jeep's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow path ahead. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately. I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. The tunnel walls glistened with moisture, and I noticed deep ruts in the ground where water had eroded the dirt floor. "Stay in the center," I said. "Those ruts look nasty." Dusty nodded, concentrating on navigating. Our voices sounded different inside, hollow and too loud at the same time. Water dripped constantly, the sound echoing against stone walls. The headlights only showed about 30 feet ahead, the beam diffused by a fine mist hanging in the air. "Look," Dusty pointed to the side. "There's one of those logs Bobby mentioned." Sure enough, a massive tree trunk, had to be at least 2 feet in diameter, lay against the wall. It looked deliberately placed, not like it had just fallen in. I frowned, trying to figure out how anyone could have moved something that heavy into the tunnel. We continued crawling forward, maybe 5 miles per hour. The tunnel curved slightly, and the darkness ahead seemed absolute. My flashlight beam bounced off the walls, revealing graffiti in places, crude drawings and names of people who'd ventured inside before us. "We're about halfway through," I said, checking my watch. We'd been inside for about 5 minutes. That's when I saw it. Along the right wall, maybe 20 feet ahead, sat what I initially thought was a large rock. The Jeep's headlights caught it at an angle that made it stand out from the tunnel wall. "What's that?" Dusty asked, slowing the Jeep even more. "Dunno. Rock, maybe?" I leaned forward, straining to see better. As we got closer, I noticed something odd. The rock had what looked like hair on it, brownish coloration too, not the black you'd expect from the bears in our area. and it sat perfectly still, partly hidden in the shadows cast by the elevated center portion of the tunnel. 10, maybe 12 feet away, we both saw it move, not shift or tumble like a rock might if disturbed by vibrations. It stood up. My brain struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. The rock unfolded, rising higher and higher until it towered at least 9 feet tall. My whole body went cold. "Holy shit," Dusty whispered. The creature turned toward our vehicle. In the headlights, I saw its face clearly for just a moment. Deep-set eyes reflected the light like a deer's would, but the intelligence behind them wasn't animal, not human either. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth that looked designed for tearing. It took a deep breath. I actually saw its massive chest expand, and then it released a sound that still haunts my dreams. Not a roar like a bear, not a scream like a person. A growl yell that echoed through the tunnel and vibrated in my chest. I'd spent my entire life in these woods, heard every animal that lived here, and nothing ever made a sound like that. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My fingers gripped the dashboard so hard my knuckles turned white. Dusty reacted first. He slammed the Jeep into reverse, his face pale as chalk. The tires spun against the damp ground before catching. We lurched backward. The creature took one step toward us. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It held something in its hand. I couldn't tell what, then threw it to the ground with force that made a noise loud enough to hear over the Jeep's engine. Then it moved. 2, maybe 3 massive strides took it from the center of the tunnel into the darkness beyond where our headlights reached. Each footstep sounded like someone dropping a cinder block. And then, nothing. Dusty backed up faster than was safe on that uneven ground. Neither of us spoke. The tunnel entrance grew larger in the rear window, daylight filtering in. When we finally burst out into the afternoon sun, he slammed on the brakes. We sat there, the engine idling, both breathing like we'd run a marathon. "Did you?" he started. "Yeah," I cut him off. "I saw it." "What the fuck was that?" His voice cracked. I shook my head. My hands were shaking. "I don't know." But I did know. Or at least I thought I did. The size, the walk, the sound it made. Everything matched stories I'd heard but never believed. Stories my grandfather told about something that lived in these woods. Something most people dismissed as legend. Dusty turned the Jeep around and drove us back toward town. We didn't talk the whole way. What could we say? Who would believe us? 2 weeks passed before either of us mentioned it. We were sitting on my porch, drinking sodas after school. The memory had festered between us, unspoken but always present. "I can't stop thinking about it," Dusty finally said. "Me neither." I crushed my empty can. "We should tell someone." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Like who? Sheriff Davis? He'll think we were smoking something in there." Dusty nodded slowly. "My dad asked why I haven't taken the Jeep out lately." "What did you tell him?" "Said I was saving gas money." We sat in silence for a while longer. "It was a Sasquatch," I said finally. The word felt strange coming out of my mouth, childish almost. Dusty didn't laugh. "Yeah, I think so too. My grandpa used to talk about something in these woods, called it the wild man, said his father had seen it once, back in the 1920s. And nobody believed him either, I bet." "Nope." I stared out at the trees behind my house. "Want to go back?" Dusty's head snapped toward me. "Are you insane?" Maybe I was. But something about that encounter had changed me. I'd seen something impossible. Something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught. What else might be real that I'd dismissed? "We need proof," I said, "or we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering if we imagined it." "I didn't imagine it," Dusty said firmly. "That thing was real, and it was pissed we were there." "Exactly. That tunnel. What if it's using it as a shelter, a home?" Dusty stood up. "Then we should stay the hell away from it." But I couldn't. The idea had taken root in me. I needed to know. 3 days later, I went back alone. Didn't tell Dusty or anyone else. Rode my mountain bike as far as I could, then hiked the rest of the way. I brought my dad's old Nikon camera, extra batteries for my flashlight, and a hunting knife. Looking back, if I'd actually encountered that thing again, none of those items would have helped me. The tunnel entrance looked different in the late afternoon light. More ominous. I stood there for almost 20 minutes, gathering my courage. Part of me hoped I wouldn't find anything, that I could dismiss the whole experience as some shared hallucination. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The temperature drop hit me immediately. Water dripped somewhere ahead. My footsteps echoed against the stone. I moved slowly, keeping the flashlight beam steady on the path ahead. About 50 feet in, I found the first log. Massive, just like before. I examined it closely this time. The ends weren't cut clean like with a chainsaw. They looked torn, splintered. I ran my fingers over the rough surface. I continued deeper. My heart pounded so loud, I was sure anything in the tunnel would hear it coming. The smell changed the further I went, earthier, with a hint of something musky I couldn't identify. Something crunched under my boot. I pointed the flashlight down and jumped back. Bones, small ones, probably rabbit or squirrel. They formed a small pile against the wall. I kept going, documenting everything with the camera. More bones, another log, strange scratches on the wall that looked deliberate. Not random, but not recognizable as any language either. I reached the spot where we'd seen it. Nothing there now, just empty tunnel. But the ground showed something interesting, a depression about 7 feet long and 4 feet wide, where the dirt floor seemed more packed down than the surrounding area, like something heavy regularly lay there. I took photos, heart racing. This was real, all of it. That's when I heard it, a rock skittering across the ground behind me. I froze, not daring to turn around. My flashlight beam shook violently. Another sound, a soft exhale. Something was in the tunnel with me. I slowly turned, raising the flashlight. Nothing, just empty tunnel stretching back toward the entrance. But I knew I wasn't alone. The hairs on my neck stood up. I felt watched. I backed away, keeping the flashlight pointed ahead. Another step, another. Something large moved in my peripheral vision. Just a shadow, gone when I turned to look directly at it. But it had been there. I ran, sprinted toward the entrance, not caring about the uneven ground. I tripped once, scraped my hands raw, catching myself, but was up again in seconds. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, creating monstrous shadows that seemed to chase me. Daylight ahead, just 100 feet, 50, 20. I burst out of the tunnel, gasping for air, kept running until I reached my bike, then pedaled harder than I ever had in my life. Didn't stop until I reached Main Street. The developed photos showed less than I'd hoped. The bone piles were clear enough, the depression in the ground too, but nothing conclusive, nothing that would convince anyone who hadn't been there. I never told Dusty I went back. He'd moved on, or at least pretended to. By summer, we were talking about college plans and girls and normal teenage stuff. The tunnel became something we acknowledged with a look sometimes, but never discussed. After graduation, I took those photos and my journal entries to Professor Alan Markham at the State University. He specialized in folklore and cryptozoology, listened to my story without interrupting, examined my evidence without dismissing it outright. "You're not the first," he said finally. "I've documented 17 similar encounters in this region since 1952. So you believe me?" He leaned back in his chair. "I believe you experienced something profound. Whether it's exactly what you think it is, well, that's why I do this work." He asked if I'd guide him to the tunnel. I refused. Some places you don't go back to, some things you don't disturb twice. 24 years have passed since that day in the tunnel. I still live in Pennsylvania, though not in Rockland anymore. got a job in wildlife management, married, had kids, normal life. But I've never forgotten, never stopped wondering about what lives in that tunnel. The thing that stood 9 feet tall and made a sound no human throat could produce. The intelligence in those eyes. Dusty moved to Arizona after college. We talk maybe once a year. Never mentioned the tunnel directly, but last Christmas he sent me a news clipping. 3 hikers gone missing near Rockland Woodhill. Search parties found nothing except one backpack. Inside it, a camera with the lens crushed. I keep tabs on Professor Markham's research. He's documented more sightings over the years, built quite a reputation in certain circles, published papers on territorial behaviors of unverified bipedal primates in North America. Sometimes I dream about going back, about seeing it again, proving to the world what I know is true. But then I remember that sound it made, the way it threw whatever it was holding, the purposeful stride as it disappeared into darkness. That wasn't just an animal we disturbed. It was something that had claimed that territory, that understood intrusion, something that wanted to be left alone. And so I do just that. I leave it alone. But I know it's there, in the forgotten backwoods of Rockland, Pennsylvania, in that half-mile of darkness where the outside world doesn't reach, and sometimes on quiet nights I could swear I hear that growl yell carried on the wind, a reminder that not everything in these woods has been discovered or understood. Some secrets belong to the darkness, and that's where they should stay. Story 2. I've always considered myself at home in the wilderness. Growing up in rural Minnesota, I spent more time among trees than people. By 2012, at 32 years old, I had completed dozens of solo hiking trips across the North Woods. The routine was comforting. Pack light, move fast, set up camp, and enjoy the solitude that only deep forest can provide. That October, I planned a 3-day trek through the Chippewa National Forest. The fall colors were at their peak, red maples and golden aspens standing stark against the dark green pines. Perfect hiking weather, crisp but not cold, with just enough chill to keep the bugs away. "I'll be back Sunday evening," I told my buddy Mike over the phone as I finished loading my truck. "I'm dropping pins every few hours so you can track my route." "You always say that, Alex," Mike replied. "Just come back in one piece. Those woods are getting weird this time of year." I laughed it off. "Bears are getting ready to hibernate, that's all. I know what I'm doing." I parked at a remote trailhead around noon on Friday. The lot was empty, exactly what I wanted. Shouldering my pack, I checked my GPS and headed north on a seldom-used trail that would take me to a ridgeline overlooking Pike Bay. The first few miles passed uneventfully. I maintained a steady pace, stopping occasionally to photograph unusual fungi or interesting rock formations. By late afternoon, I reached my intended campsite, a small clearing about 20 yards from the trail, nestled between 2 massive white pines. I set up my tent efficiently, stowed my food in a bear bag, hung 15 feet up a nearby tree, and collected firewood before the light faded. After a simple dinner of dehydrated stew, I decided to take a sunset hike to the ridge. I grabbed my flashlight, water bottle, and pocket knife, leaving most of my gear secured at camp. The forest was growing quiet as daylight waned, with only the occasional call of a barred owl breaking the silence. The trail narrowed as I climbed higher. Pine needles cushioned my footsteps, making my progress nearly soundless. I lost track of time, my mind wandering to work problems and bills waiting back home. The rhythm of hiking often put me in an almost meditative state. The first unusual sound barely registered. A branch snapped somewhere off to my left, maybe 50 yards away. I paused, listening. When nothing followed, I continued hiking, attributing it to a deer or maybe a black bear foraging for autumn berries. 10 minutes later, it happened again. Another snap, closer this time, followed by a shuffling sound, something large moving through the underbrush. I stopped completely, eyes scanning the darkening forest. The trees were thick here, limiting visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. If it was a bear, announcing my presence wasn't the worst idea, but something felt off. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. I decided to turn back toward camp. The sun was nearly down anyway, and I hadn't brought my headlamp for night hiking. I'd covered about half the distance back when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that didn't belong to any animal I recognized from these woods. It wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was deeper, more guttural, and it came from somewhere behind me. The hair on my arms and neck stood up. A cold sensation washed over me, despite the hiking warmth. I quickened my pace, no longer concerned about making noise. Whatever was back there, I wanted distance between us. That's when the smell hit me, so sudden and overwhelming that I nearly gagged. It was like someone had left a pile of garbage, soaked in urine, baking in the sun for weeks. But there was something else underneath, a metallic tang that reminded me of blood. The stench was so thick I could almost taste it. I pulled my shirt collar over my nose and moved faster, nearly jogging now. The growl came again, louder. It was following me. Not hunting, at least not yet, but definitely tracking. I felt its eyes on my back, watching my every move. The remaining distance to my campsite felt endless. Twilight had faded to nearly full darkness, forcing me to use my flashlight. Its beam seemed feeble against the pressing blackness of the forest. I stumbled twice on exposed roots, my coordination compromised by rising panic. When I finally reached my clearing, I immediately built up the fire, adding larger logs than I normally would. The extra light and heat provided little comfort. The smell had followed me here, hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. I sat with my back to the fire, facing the darkness beyond my camp. My eyes strained to detect movement in the shadows. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, no night birds calling, no small creatures rustling through the undergrowth, just silence and that putrid odor. I considered packing up and hiking out, but the thought of navigating those trails in complete darkness terrified me more than staying put. My tent offered no real protection, but abandoning my campsite without preparation would be suicide. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first knock. It sounded like someone had taken a baseball bat to a tree trunk, a sharp, deliberate impact that echoed through the forest. 15 seconds later, another knock responded from the opposite direction, then a third from yet another location. I was surrounded. My mind raced through possible explanations. Rangers checking the area? No. They would identify themselves and wouldn't be making those sounds. Other hikers playing pranks? The trailhead had been empty, and these were rarely used paths. The knocks continued, sometimes in sequence, sometimes overlapping. They were communicating, whatever they were, coordinating. I grabbed my phone. No signal, as expected, this deep in the forest. I checked my GPS position and sent another pin drop anyway, hoping it would sync when I reached civilization. I typed a quick message to Mike. "Something's wrong. Coming out early. Call ranger station if not back by morning." A massive crack sounded just beyond the firelight. Not a knock this time. The sound of a tree limb being broken clean off its trunk. It would have taken tremendous strength to make that noise. The stench intensified. I could see nothing beyond the circle of firelight, but I felt watched from every direction. Whatever was out there, it wasn't alone, and it wasn't normal wildlife. I'd heard stories all my life. Everyone in rural Minnesota has. Tales of hunters gone missing, strange footprints found in muddy riverbanks, livestock spooked by something in the night. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. The legends whispered around campfires but dismissed in the light of day. I never believed them. Not really. But sitting there, surrounded by unknown presences communicating through tree knocks, smelling that ungodly stench. What else could it be? No known animal behaved this way. No human could produce that smell or move through dense forest with such power. My fire began to die down, despite my efforts to maintain it. The darkness pressed closer. The knocking increased in tempo and volume. Some impacts so forceful I could feel vibrations through the ground. Around midnight, something large moved just at the edge of visibility. I caught only a glimpse, a massive dark shape shifting between trees. It stood upright, at least 7 feet tall. When I directed my flashlight toward it, it retreated instantly into deeper shadows. That was it. I couldn't stay. With shaking hands, I began packing my essential gear. Sleeping bag, water filter, GPS, phone, knife, some energy bars. I left the tent and cooking equipment. They weren't worth the time it would take to break down camp properly. I shoved everything into my backpack, moving as quietly as possible despite my racing heart. The knocking had stopped. The silence was somehow worse, heavy with anticipation. They were watching me prepare to leave. I could feel it. I hoisted my pack, clutched my flashlight in my right hand and my hunting knife in my left, and headed for the trail. The odor was overwhelming now, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. I forced myself to breathe through my mouth as I picked my way toward the path that would lead back to the trailhead. I'd gone maybe 10 yards when I heard movement directly behind me, heavy footsteps crushing the forest floor. I broke into a run, abandoning any pretense of stealth. The flashlight beam bounced wildly ahead of me, barely illuminating enough ground to keep me from crashing into trees. Something large paralleled my course, moving through the forest to my right. Another presence crashed through the underbrush to my left. They were escorting me out, herding me toward the trail. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, lungs burning, legs pumping, branches whipped across my face, drawing blood. I tripped over exposed roots and scrambled back up, driven by pure fear. The sounds of pursuit never faded, keeping pace effortlessly with my desperate flight. How long I ran, I can't say. Time lost meaning in that nightmare chase. Eventually, the trail widened and began to descend. I recognized landmarks from my hike in, a distinctive boulder, a lightning-struck tree. I was nearing the trailhead. As I broke through the final stretch of forest, the sounds of pursuit abruptly stopped. The stench lingered a moment longer, then dissipated as if carried away by a sudden breeze. I emerged into the parking lot, gasping for air, legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. My truck sat alone in the gravel lot, exactly as I'd left it. I fumbled with the keys, dropped them, snatched them back up with shaking hands. It took 3 attempts to get the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I nearly wept with relief. I threw the truck into reverse, tires spitting gravel as I backed up and swung around toward the access road. As my headlights swept across the tree line, I caught a final glimpse, a massive shape standing just inside the forest edge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair. It moved back into deeper cover before I could focus properly, leaving me with only an impression of size and power. I drove white-knuckled all the way back to the highway, checking my rearview mirror obsessively. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:17 a.m. when I finally reached cell service. My phone immediately buzzed with incoming messages. Mike responding to my earlier text, asking if I was okay. I pulled over and called him. "Alex, what the hell, man? You okay?" His voice was thick with sleep. "I'm coming home," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Something was out there, Mike. Something—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Where are you now? Want me to meet you somewhere?" "No, I'm on the highway. I'll be home in an hour." I hung up before he could ask more questions I couldn't answer. The drive home passed in a blur. Every shadow on the road made my heart rate spike. Every sound that wasn't the truck's engine made me flinch. I kept the windows up tight, despite the stuffiness inside the cab, afraid that somehow that smell would find its way back to me. I pulled into my driveway at 3:22 a.m. The familiar sight of my small house, porch light glowing just as I'd left it, finally allowed me to exhale fully. I sat in the truck for several long minutes, waiting for my hands to stop shaking before attempting to unlock my front door. Inside, I dropped my backpack on the floor and headed straight for the shower. I stood under scalding water for 20 minutes, trying to wash away the lingering sensation of being watched, of being hunted. The hot water ran out before the feeling did. Wrapped in a bathrobe, I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, jumping at every creak of the house settling. When sunlight finally streamed through the windows, I made coffee with mechanical movements, my mind still back in those dark woods. Mike came by around noon, letting himself in with the spare key I'd given him years ago. "Jesus, Alex, you look like hell," he said, taking in my bloodshot eyes and the scratches on my face. "I didn't sleep," I replied, pouring him a cup of coffee. "What happened out there?" He sat across from me, concern etched on his weathered face. I tried to explain, the knocking, the smell, the shapes moving through the forest. It sounded crazy even as I said it, but Mike didn't interrupt, didn't smirk or shake his head. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "My uncle used to work Forest Service up near the Boundary Waters," he finally said. He had stories, things the old-timers would talk about in the ranger stations late at night, things they'd seen but wouldn't put in reports. "Bigfoot?" I asked, the word feeling strange on my tongue. Mike shrugged. "They called it different names, but yeah, same idea." We sat in silence, the implications hanging between us. "I'm never hiking alone again," I said finally. "Never." Mike nodded. "Buddy system from now on. I'll go with you next time." But we both knew there wouldn't be a next time, not for me. Not in those deep forests where ancient things still moved through the shadows. The wilderness I'd loved all my life had shown me its other face, the one it keeps hidden from human eyes. I still live in Minnesota. I still go outside. But I stay in state parks, campgrounds with other people nearby, places where the trees are thinned and the trails are well maintained, places where strange knocks don't echo in the night and where nothing large enough to break tree limbs with its bare hands watches from the darkness. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows a certain way, I catch a whiff of something that makes my stomach clench and my heart race, that same putrid mixture of rot, urine and blood. When that happens, I close my windows tight and turn up the television, drowning out the silence that might hide other sounds, sounds like heavy footsteps or the deliberate knocking of wood against wood. They're still out there, watching, waiting. I was allowed to leave, but I can't shake the feeling that it was a one-time courtesy, a warning perhaps. The deep wilderness doesn't belong to us anymore. Maybe it never did. Story 3. The first scream tore through the night like a knife. I froze mid-sentence, my course textbook still open on my lap. It was unmistakably human. A woman's voice pushed to its breaking point. The sound echoed across the academy grounds, bouncing off the dormitory walls. "What the hell was that?" I asked, looking up at Travis, my roommate. Travis didn't even flinch. He just kept arranging his gear for tomorrow's drill, methodically folding his uniform on the narrow bed across from mine. "That's the local Bigfoot," he said without looking up. I laughed, but Travis didn't join in. Outside our window, I noticed something odd. The usual evening sounds of the academy, cadets calling to each other, doors slamming, music playing from distant rooms, had completely stopped. The silence felt heavy, unnatural. "You're kidding, right?" I finally said. Travis shrugged. "Wish I was, Ellison." "My name is Marcus Ellison. It was the summer of 1991, and I was 6 weeks into basic training at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. At 20 years old, I'd left behind the flat farmlands of Nebraska for the towering Rocky Mountains. The academy campus sat nestled against the foothills, surrounded by thick forest that climbed up into higher elevations. Beautiful country, but tonight it suddenly felt alien. Travis sat on his bed and finally looked at me. My buddy Carson from 2nd Squadron, he saw it last semester. He was doing some solo PT near the lake, and he heard splashing. Thought it was deer or something. And, I prompted when he paused. He said he saw this massive, hairy thing kneeling by the water drinking, like a man, but bigger, much bigger. When it noticed Carson, it stood up. He says it must have been 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and then it just disappeared into the trees, moved fast as hell. I rolled my eyes. Your buddy was probably hallucinating from dehydration. Maybe, Travis said, returning to his gear. But that wasn't the first time someone's seen it. Locals have been reporting sightings for decades, and that scream happens every few months, always at night. Great ghost story, I said, trying to sound dismissive despite the chill running down my spine. Not a ghost, Ellison. Something flesh and blood. The conversation shifted back to our upcoming week-long field training exercise in Jack's Valley, a rugged training area about a mile from the main campus. But the scream and Travis's matter-of-fact explanation stuck with me. I kept glancing at the window, at the darkness beyond, where the mountains loomed invisible against the night sky. The next morning was bright and clear, the academy grounds bustling with activity as if nothing had happened. I half convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing, but when I mentioned the scream to other cadets in the mess hall, I got knowing looks. "Academy Bigfoot," said Wilson, a cadet from Georgia. "My squad leader told me about it first week here." "You guys are ridiculous," I said, shoveling eggs into my mouth. "Probably just a mountain lion or something." "Mountain lions don't sound like women screaming bloody murder," Phillips chimed in. "And they don't leave footprints twice the size of a man's boot." I stopped eating. "Someone found footprints?" Phillips nodded. "Few years back. Some cadets poured plaster casts. Story goes, the Air Force confiscated them." "Oh, come on," I laughed. "Now you sound like one of those UFO nuts." But despite my skepticism, I couldn't shake the uneasiness that had settled over me. Jack's Valley loomed ahead. 7 days of combat training, obstacle courses, and survival exercises. 7 days and nights in the woods at the foot of the mountains. Jack's Valley hit us like a hammer. The July heat baked the dusty training grounds, and drill instructors pushed us through grueling obstacle courses. We crawled under barbed wire, scaled walls, and navigated underground tunnels while instructors shouted in our ears. By sunset each day, I collapsed into my bunk in the field barracks, muscles screaming. But as exhausted as I was, I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush outside our barracks snapped me awake. I'd lie there, heart pounding, listening for that scream again, or worse, heavy footsteps approaching. On the 3rd night, I woke to someone shaking my shoulder. Travis stood over me, already dressed in his camo uniform. "Ellison, wake up. We've got night nav exercises." I groaned and checked my watch. 2:30 a.m. Night navigation was a standard part of training, using compass and map to find your way through unfamiliar terrain in complete darkness. Usually we did it in teams. Tonight, apparently, we'd be going solo. "Each cadet will be given coordinates for 5 checkpoints," our instructor explained once we'd assembled outside. The moon hung high and full, casting everything in silvery light. "You'll navigate to each point. Punch your card with the unique hole punch you'll find there, then proceed to the next. Complete the course and return to base by 0500. Any questions?" No one spoke. We were too tired, too focused on just getting through it. "Remember," the instructor added, sweeping his gaze across our faces, "stay within the designated training area. The boundary is marked with orange tape. Cross it, and you're automatically failed and recycled." We were issued our maps, compasses, and checkpoint coordinates, then sent off one by one in different directions. I studied my first coordinates, oriented my map, and set off into the woods. The first checkpoint was easy, just half a mile north, at the base of a distinctive rock formation. I found the marker, punched my card, and plotted my course to the second point. This one was trickier, located in a dense stand of pines on higher ground. As I climbed, the forest grew thicker. Moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, and I had to use my red lens flashlight to check my compass. The forest felt alive around me, rustling, creaking, breathing. Normal sounds, I told myself, just wind in the trees. I found the second checkpoint tucked between two massive boulders and quickly punched my card. 3 more to go. The third checkpoint was nearly a mile east in a small clearing. Halfway there, I heard voices ahead. Other cadets, I assumed, perhaps converging on the same checkpoint from different directions, but as I approached, the voices stopped abruptly. Then a crashing sound, like something large moving rapidly through the underbrush, away from me. "Hello?" I called out, then immediately regretted it. We were supposed to complete the exercise without assistance. No answer came. I pushed forward, more cautiously now. When I reached the clearing, I found the checkpoint marker right where it should be, but the ground around it was torn up, like something had been digging, or like there had been a struggle. I punched my card with shaking hands and quickly plotted my course to the fourth checkpoint, which lay near a small stream. The sound of running water guided me the last 100 yards. I found the marker, punched my card, and paused to fill my canteen. That's when I smelled it, a powerful musky odor like wet dog and rotting vegetation. My nose wrinkled involuntarily. Something rustled in the bushes across the stream. "Who's there?" I called, louder than I'd intended. The rustling stopped. I stared hard into the darkness, but saw nothing. After a tense minute, I convinced myself it was probably a deer or raccoon and continued to my final checkpoint. The last marker was located at the edge of a small lake, the same lake, I realized with a jolt, where Travis's friend had reported seeing the creature. I approached slowly, scanning the shoreline. Moonlight reflected off the still water, illuminating the area in soft light. I found the marker easily enough, punched my card, and was about to head back to base when I noticed something in the mud by the water's edge. Footprints, large ones, much bigger than my boots would make. They led from the water into the trees. I knelt to examine them more closely. They weren't bear tracks. I'd seen those before on hunting trips with my dad. These were elongated with 5 distinct toe impressions, like a human foot but massive. The newest prints were still filling with water, which meant whatever made them had just been here. A twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, heart hammering, nothing but shadows between the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eyes on me from the darkness. "This is Cadet Ellison," I said loudly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Identify yourself." Silence. Then a low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite human. Goosebumps erupted across my skin. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran. Not my proudest moment as a future Air Force officer, but in that moment, training and discipline gave way to pure instinct. I sprinted back toward base, not bothering with the compass, just following the path of least resistance through the trees. A branch caught my cheek, drawing blood. I stumbled over roots and rocks, but kept moving. Behind me, was that heavy footsteps, or just my imagination amplifying the sound of my own boots on the forest floor? I burst from the tree line into the cleared area around our field barracks. Several instructors looked up in surprise at my headlong flight. "Cadet Ellison," one barked, "what's your malfunction?" I skidded to a stop, suddenly aware of how this looked. I was panting, wild-eyed, bleeding from a scratch on my face. I'd just run full tilt out of a training exercise. "Sir, What could I say? That I ran because I was scared of Bigfoot. "I thought someone was following me, sir." The instructor's face hardened. "This isn't a game, cadet. You're being evaluated on your ability to function under stress." "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." He examined my punch card. "At least you completed all checkpoints. Return to barracks and clean yourself up." I nodded and walked toward the barracks, feeling foolish now in the relative safety of the base. Other cadets were starting to return from their navigation exercises, looking tired but composed. Not like me, the panicked rookie who'd let ghost stories get to him. Travis found me sitting on my bunk, dabbing at the cut on my cheek. "What happened to you?" he asked, dropping his gear on his bed. I hesitated, then decided to tell him. "I saw footprints by the lake. Big ones. Fresh." Travis's eyes widened slightly. "No kidding? What did you do?" "Ran like hell when I heard something in the woods behind me." He nodded slowly. "Smart move. Carson still hasn't gotten over what he saw." "You really believe all this, don't you?" I asked. "I believe there's a lot of weird shit in these mountains that doesn't have a proper explanation," Travis said. "My grandpa used to say, just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean it can't kill you." Those words stuck with me through the remaining days at Jack's Valley. I completed my training exercises with extra vigilance, always aware of my surroundings, always listening for unusual sounds. I never ventured out alone, if I could help it. On our final night in Jack's Valley, our squad was assigned perimeter watch, 2 hours of guard duty at the edge of the encampment. My shift ran from midnight to 2 a.m., and I was paired with Phillips. We paced our section of the perimeter, staying within sight of each other as regulations required. The night was cloudy, the darkness nearly complete. Our red lens flashlights carved small tunnels of visibility in the blackness. "You hear that?" Phillips asked suddenly, about an hour into our shift. I stopped, listening intently. At first, nothing. Then a faint sound carried on the wind. Crying? No, more like whimpering. "Sounds like it's coming from the tree line," I whispered. Phillips nodded. "Should we check it out?" "Negative," I said firmly. "We're not supposed to leave the perimeter." "Could be a cadet in trouble," Phillips argued. The whimpering grew louder, more distinct. It did sound human, a woman maybe, or a child. My stomach knotted with indecision. "I'll radio it in," I said, reaching for my comm unit. Before I could call it in, the whimpering abruptly changed. It deepened, distorted, transforming into a low, guttural growl that raised the hair on my arms. Then silence. Phillips and I exchanged looks. His face, illuminated by the red beam of his flashlight, showed the same alarm I felt. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I'm definitely reporting it." I raised the radio and called in a possible security concern near our position. The duty officer acknowledged and said they'd send a patrol to investigate. 10 minutes later, 2 instructors arrived, looking irritated at being roused from their quarters. "What exactly did you hear, cadet?" one asked after I'd explained. "A whimpering sound, sir, followed by a growl. Came from those trees there." The instructors exchanged glances. "Probably coyotes," the senior one said. "They can sound remarkably human sometimes." "This wasn't a coyote, sir," Phillips interjected. "I've heard plenty of coyotes back home in Montana. This was different." "Different how, cadet?" The instructor's tone was challenging now. Phillips hesitated. "Just different, sir." The instructors made a cursory inspection of the area with their flashlights, found nothing, and returned to base, leaving us with a warning not to call in wildlife sightings unless there was clear danger to personnel. "They know," Phillips said once they were gone. "Know what?" "About whatever's out there. They just don't want to admit it." I wasn't sure if I believed that, but I was relieved when our shift ended and we could return to the relative safety of the barracks. We returned to the main campus the next day. As we marched back across the academy grounds, the Rocky Mountains rose behind us, majestic and inscrutable. Somewhere in those forests, something had screamed like a woman in terror. Something had left massive footprints by a lake. Something had mimicked a human cry, then growled from the darkness. Or maybe it was all just wildlife and overactive imaginations. The rational part of me wanted to believe that, but I couldn't forget the footprints, the smell, the feeling of being watched. I never saw the creature locals called Bigfoot during my time at the academy. Never got direct visual confirmation of what was out there. But in the years since, I found myself paying closer attention to reports of unexplained phenomena in remote areas. I've learned that indigenous peoples across North America have traditions of wild men, forest giants, and other humanoid creatures dating back centuries. Are these stories just cultural myths, misidentifications of bears or other known animals? Or is there something else out there, something science hasn't classified? I don't know. But I do know this. After that summer of 1991, I never again dismissed such accounts out of hand. The academy taught me discipline, tactics, leadership. But Jack's Valley taught me something else. The world is stranger than we imagine, and there are corners of darkness where unknown things still dwell. Even now, years later, when I'm hiking in remote areas, I find myself scanning the tree line, listening for unusual sounds, just in case. Because once you've heard that scream in the night, you never quite forget it. And you never quite convince yourself it was just the wind. Story 4. I'd failed twice before. Mount Elbert had beaten me with violent snowstorms and vicious winds that threatened to sweep me off the mountain face. But the morning of June 22nd, 2009, felt different. The sun rose bright and clear over the Colorado Rockies as I loaded my gear into my rented Jeep. Today would be the day. Third time's the charm, eh, James? I muttered to myself, checking my backpack one final time. Water bottles, energy bars, first aid kit, extra socks, camera, map, compass, and my Springfield XD 9mm handgun in its holster. I'd gotten my concealed carry permit 3 years ago, mostly for peace of mind on solo expeditions like this one. Mountain lions were common enough in these parts. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I arrived at 6:15 a.m. Perfect. I'd chosen the East Ridge route specifically because it was less traveled, and I wanted the solitude. The weather report promised clear skies all day, with temperatures in the mid-70s, practically balmy for 14,000 feet. My boots crunched on the gravel path as I started my ascent. The lower portion of the trail wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, their leaves catching the morning light. I settled into a steady rhythm, my trekking poles clicking against rocks and hard-packed earth. My breath came in measured puffs, not yet labored. I'd trained for this, spent months building my endurance on the local trails back home in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. By 10:30 a.m. I'd cleared the tree line. The landscape opened up into alpine tundra, scattered with hardy wildflowers that had pushed through the last patches of snow. The summit loomed ahead, imposing yet inviting. Up here, the air thinned noticeably, and I slowed my pace to compensate, one foot in front of the other. No rush. The mountain had waited millions of years for me. It could wait a few more hours. I stopped for lunch around noon at 13,000 feet, perched on a sun-warmed boulder. Below me stretched the Arkansas River Valley, a ribbon of green winding through the rugged landscape. I munched on a protein bar and beef jerky, washing it down with electrolyte-enhanced water. Not exactly a gourmet meal, but functional. My legs felt strong, my lungs working efficiently despite the altitude. The final push to the summit took longer than expected. The trail grew steeper, rockier, demanding more concentration with each step. But at 1:45 p.m., I stepped onto the highest point in Colorado, 14,140 feet above sea level. The victory was private, personal. No one to high-five, no one to share the moment with, just me and the endless sky. "Finally got you," I said aloud to the mountain, my voice immediately carried away by the light breeze. I took my time at the summit, drinking in the panoramic views that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Mountain ranges folded into each other like wrinkled fabric, valleys carved by ancient glaciers, distant lakes shimmering like mirrors. I pulled out my digital camera, a Nikon D90 I'd splurged on last Christmas, and captured dozens of shots, turning in a full circle to memorialize the moment. After signing the summit register, James Westbrook, Oak Ridge, TN, third time's the charm, I began my descent at 2:30 p.m. I chose a different route down, following the less popular Northeast Ridge Trail. It would be longer but gentler on my knees, and I had plenty of daylight left. The terrain changed gradually as I made my way down. Rocky scree gave way to alpine meadows, which eventually merged with scattered stands of gnarled, wind-twisted trees. By 3:30 p.m. I descended to approximately 12,000 feet, where the tree cover became denser. The trail narrowed, winding between towering pines that blocked much of the afternoon sun. I hadn't seen another hiker all day, which wasn't surprising given my choice of routes. That's when I heard it. The sound cut through the mountain silence like a knife. A high-pitched wail that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal. Something between a scream and a growl. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off distant rock walls so I couldn't pinpoint its source. The hair on my arms stood up instantly, and my pace froze mid-step. I stood completely still, listening. The mountain had gone silent. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. Even the breeze seemed to have died. My right hand moved instinctively to the holster at my hip, unsnapping the safety strap, but not drawing the weapon. Years of hunting had taught me to identify the calls of most North American wildlife, but this was different. Not a mountain lion, not a bear, not an elk or moose. I scanned the forest around me, turning slowly to cover all 360 degrees. Nothing moved. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching longer as the afternoon progressed. Then I saw it. About 50 yards downslope, partially obscured by a cluster of pine trees, stood a figure. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as a bear standing on its hind legs, but the proportions were all wrong. It stood upright like a human, but much taller, at least 7.5 feet. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, a mottled pattern of dark brown and black. Even from this distance, I could see its massive shoulders, its long arms that hung lower than a human's would. We stared at each other across the distance. My hand remained on my pistol, but I didn't draw it. Some instinct told me not to make any sudden movements. The creature's head was large, set directly on those powerful shoulders with little visible neck. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but I felt its eyes on me, intelligent, assessing. For 5, maybe 10 seconds, we remained locked in this standoff. My heart hammered so hard against my ribs I thought the sound might carry across the distance between us. My mouth went dry. My legs trembled slightly, though whether from the day's exertion or fear I couldn't tell. Then, without warning, the creature turned and moved away from me, down the mountain. It didn't exactly run. The movement was more like powerful bounding strides. Its gait was unmistakably bipedal, but with a fluid efficiency I'd never seen in a human. Its upper back and shoulders had a slight hunch to them as it moved, arms swinging in counterbalance. In seconds, it had covered ground that would have taken me minutes to traverse. I watched, transfixed, as it disappeared into the denser forest below, visible for perhaps 10 seconds total before the trees swallowed it. The sound of breaking branches and disturbed undergrowth continued for a few moments longer, then faded. My hand was still on my pistol. I drew it now, the weight of the loaded gun somehow reassuring in my trembling fingers. I scanned the trees again, listening intently, but heard nothing beyond the sudden return of normal forest sounds. A distant bird call, the rustle of wind through pine needles. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "What the actual hell?" I stood frozen for several more minutes, processing what I'd seen. Every explanation my rational mind offered up fell short. Too big for a bear, wrong proportions for a moose, wrong color for an elk. And it had stood upright, moved upright with a confidence and purpose that no animal I knew could manage. Bigfoot. The word formed in my mind unbidden. I'd never given much credence to the legends. Sure, I'd seen the grainy Patterson-Gimlin film like everyone else, but I'd always filed it away with UFO sightings and ghost stories. Now my skepticism felt like sand slipping through my fingers. I needed to keep moving. Standing still made me a target, and though the creature had fled from me, I couldn't be sure it was gone for good, or that it was alone. I held my pistol at the ready and continued down the trail, my pace quicker now despite my fatigue. Every few steps I stopped to listen, to look behind me, and scan the forest to either side. The remaining descent was the longest 2 hours of my life. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system. I found myself avoiding denser patches of forest, choosing the more exposed sections of trail where visibility was better. The afternoon sun began to dip toward the western peaks, casting longer shadows that played tricks on my eyes. When I finally reached the trailhead parking lot, my rental Jeep sat alone, exactly as I'd left it. I circled the vehicle, checking underneath and around it before unlocking the door and climbing inside. Only when the doors were locked and the engine running did I holster my pistol. The drive back to my rental cabin took 40 minutes. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something massive emerging from the tree line behind me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Inside the cabin, I dropped my backpack on the wooden floor and sank into a chair at the small kitchen table. My legs felt like rubber, my mind racing. I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon from the bottle I'd brought along to celebrate my summit victory and drank it in 2 large gulps. As the alcohol spread warmth through my chest, a thought struck me. My camera. I'd had my camera the entire time. I lunged for my backpack, unzipping it with clumsy fingers. The Nikon was there, nestled safely between my extra clothing and food supplies. I powered it on, hands still trembling slightly, and began scrolling through the images. Summit panoramas, close-ups of alpine flowers, a marmot I'd spotted near the top, but nothing of what I'd seen on the descent. The camera had been in my backpack the entire time, and in those crucial moments I hadn't even thought to reach for it. I leaned back in the chair, a mixture of disappointment and relief washing over me. Disappointment that I had no evidence beyond my own testimony. Relief that I'd had the presence of mind to remain still when confronted by something so outside my understanding. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside the cabin, the wind in the pines, a raccoon knocking over the trash can, the distant call of a night bird, jolted me fully awake. I lay in bed with my pistol on the nightstand, replaying the encounter in my mind. The next morning I packed my things and checked out of the cabin a day earlier than planned. The desk clerk, a weathered local named Earl, raised an eyebrow at my early departure. "Summit not worth the trouble?" he asked, processing my credit card. I hesitated. "No, I made it. Just saw something weird on the way down." Earl looked up, his eyes suddenly sharp with interest. "Weird how? Like something big in the woods, walking on 2 legs?" His expression didn't change, but he lowered his voice. "Northeast Ridge Trail?" I nodded, surprised. Earl handed me my receipt, then leaned forward across the desk. "You ain't the first. Rangers don't like us talking about it to tourists. Bad for business. But every couple years, someone comes down from that section with a story. Most don't say nothing official, afraid of getting laughed at, but we know." "You believe in Bigfoot?" I asked, testing his reaction. He shrugged. "Don't matter what I call it. Something's up there. Always has been. Locals don't hunt on that side of the mountain after dark." I drove back to Denver in a daze, Earl's words echoing in my head. At the airport, I nearly told my story to the TSA agent who asked about my trip, but stopped myself at the last second. I wasn't ready for the inevitable skepticism, the barely concealed smirks. On the flight home to Tennessee, I stared out the window at the Rockies growing smaller beneath me. I knew what I'd seen. I didn't need a blurry photograph or a plaster cast of a footprint to validate my experience. The memory was etched into my mind with perfect clarity. The matted fur, the fluid motion, the intelligence in that brief, shared moment of recognition. Mount Elbert had finally allowed me to reach its summit, but it had also shown me something else, something few people ever witnessed. I'd gone searching for the highest point in Colorado and found instead the edges of what I thought I knew about the world. I never told the full story to anyone except my wife, who believed me without question. I never went back to Mount Elbert either. Some experiences don't need to be repeated to be remembered. Some mountains, once climbed, stay with you forever. Story 5. My hands trembled as I loaded the last piece of equipment into the rented SUV. The cool morning air of Chilliwack, British Columbia, bit at my exposed skin, but I hardly noticed. My mind was focused on what lay ahead, 2 weeks alone in the wilderness, searching for what most people consider a myth. My name is Nathan Parker, and I've spent the last 15 years studying Bigfoot sightings across North America. I've interviewed hundreds of witnesses, analyzed countless photos, and visited dozens of alleged encounter sites. But this trip would be different. This time, I was going deep into one of the most active Bigfoot hotspots in the world. "You all set, Mr. Parker?" The rental agent handed me the keys to the black Ford Explorer. "Remember, cell service is spotty up where you're headed, and the weather can turn fast this time of year." "I'm prepared," I said, tucking the keys into my pocket. "Done this kind of thing before." That wasn't entirely true. I'd done weekend excursions, but never a full 2-week solo expedition. I'd spent months planning this trip, researching locations, gathering equipment, and preparing mentally. May 2009 offered the perfect window, after the harsh winter but before summer tourists flooded the region. The drive to the cabin took 3 hours. The paved roads eventually gave way to gravel, then to a rutted dirt path that tested the SUV's suspension. Trees pressed in from both sides, creating a natural tunnel. I checked my GPS against the hand-drawn map provided by the cabin owner, a local logger named Jim Blackwell, who claimed his grandfather had encountered a wild man in these woods back in the 1940s. The cabin appeared around a bend, a simple one-room structure with a small covered porch. Nothing fancy, but it had a wood stove, a bed, and a basic kitchen setup. The outhouse stood 20 yards behind the main structure. I spent the remainder of that first day unpacking and organizing my gear. Thermal cameras, regular cameras with night vision capability, audio recorders, plaster casting materials, measuring tape, notebooks, first aid supplies, food for 2 weeks, water purification equipment, and clothes for all weather conditions. Everything had its place in my systematic approach. Night fell quickly in the forest. I sat on the porch, listening to the wilderness sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the sighing of wind through the trees. Somewhere out there, I believed, was the evidence that would vindicate my years of research. I began my search at first light. The map I'd created marked 7 Bigfoot sightings within a 15-mile radius of the cabin, reported over the past decade. I planned to investigate each location methodically, starting with the closest, a creek bed about 3 miles northeast, where a hunter claimed to have seen a large, hair-covered figure drinking water 2 years ago. The forest was dense. Pine needles cushioned my footsteps as I navigated around fallen logs and through brambles. I recorded everything on my handheld camera, narrating my observations in a low voice. The scientific part of my brain remained alert for signs of wildlife, unusual breaks in the foliage, or areas that might preserve footprints. The first 3 days yielded nothing but sore muscles and mosquito bites. I found plenty of deer tracks, some bear scat, and even photographed a family of raccoons, but nothing that couldn't be explained by known wildlife. I began to feel the familiar twinge of doubt. Maybe this trip would end like so many others, with interesting wilderness experiences, but no concrete evidence. On the morning of the fourth day, I hiked to a remote area about 7 miles northwest of the cabin. The terrain changed gradually, becoming rockier with less underbrush. A small stream cut through the landscape, creating muddy banks on either side. Perfect conditions for track preservation. I nearly walked right past it. My eyes were scanning the tree line when my boot sank slightly into softer ground. I looked down and stopped breathing for a moment. There, in the damp earth, was a footprint. Not an animal print, not a boot print, something else entirely. I crouched down, my heart pounding against my ribs. The impression was enormous, easily 18 inches long and 8 inches across at its widest point. 5 distinct toe impressions were clearly visible at the front. The depth of the print suggested tremendous weight. The midfoot showed a distinctive arch, similar to a human foot, but proportionally different. "Holy shit," I whispered, fumbling for my camera. My hands shook as I photographed the print from multiple angles, placing my own boot beside it for scale. My size 11 hiking boot looked like a child's footwear by comparison. After taking dozens of photos, I carefully removed the plaster casting kit from my backpack. I mixed the plaster with water from my canteen, poured it into the impression, and waited for it to set. While it dried, I scanned the surrounding area and discovered something that made my pulse race even faster. A line of similar prints extending into the forest. Each footprint was spaced about 5 feet apart, indicating a walking stride length that would be impossible for a human to maintain comfortably. The prints moved with purpose, not the random wandering of an animal. They headed toward higher elevation, deeper into the wilderness. I spent 3 hours documenting the tracks, measuring, photographing, and making plaster casts of the best preserved examples. The consistency between prints was remarkable. Same size, same distinctive toe pattern, same weight distribution characteristics. Whatever made these was bipedal, massive, and moving deliberately through the landscape. As I worked, I mentally cycled through alternative explanations. Could someone have faked these tracks? The remote location made that unlikely. We were miles from the nearest road, and the prints continued over difficult terrain. A hoaxer would have needed to carry heavy equipment through the wilderness. For what purpose? To fool a random hiker who might never come this way? Could they be bear tracks? No, the stride pattern was all wrong, and bears leave distinctive claw marks. These prints showed no claw impressions, just large human-like toes. I decided to follow the tracks as far as I could. They led me uphill, through a stand of old-growth pines, across a small streambed where faint wet impressions remained on some rocks, and into an area of dense vegetation. Eventually, I lost the trail where the ground became rocky and covered with pine needles. By then, the light was starting to fade. I marked the location on my GPS and reluctantly headed back toward the cabin, my backpack now heavier with plaster casts. The hike back took longer than expected. Darkness had fully descended by the time the cabin came into view, and I needed my headlamp to navigate the final mile. Inside the cabin, I laid out my finds on the small table. The dried plaster casts captured every detail of the prints. I compared them to known Bigfoot track casts I'd studied and found striking similarities. The proportions, the distinctive mid-tarsal break in the foot structure, these matched characteristics reported in other credible Bigfoot prints found throughout the Pacific Northwest. I recorded a detailed account of the day's discoveries into my audio journal, trying to maintain scientific detachment despite my excitement. May 14th, 2009. Located a series of unidentified bipedal tracks approximately 7 miles northwest of base camp. The subject appears to weigh at least 600 to 800 pounds, based on impression depth. Stride length indicates a height of potentially 8 to 9 feet. Tracks show clear anatomical details inconsistent with known wildlife. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the discovery in my mind, planning my next steps. I would return to the same area tomorrow, hoping to find more evidence, or perhaps even glimpse the creature that left those massive footprints. Around 2:30 a.m., a sound jolted me fully awake. A heavy crack echoed through the forest, like a massive tree branch snapping, followed by what sounded like something large moving through the underbrush outside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest appeared still, but the night sounds had stopped. No insects chirping, no owls hooting, just absolute silence. That unnatural quiet lasted for nearly 10 minutes before the normal woodland sounds gradually resumed. I spent the next 4 days returning to the track site and exploring the surrounding area. Each day I found more evidence, additional footprints, broken branches well above head height, and even what appeared to be hair samples caught on a jagged piece of bark. I collected everything meticulously, documenting each find with photographs, measurements, and GPS coordinates. On the 8th night of my stay, the encounters intensified. I was awakened by 3 distinct knocks, wood on wood, coming from the forest edge about 50 yards from the cabin. Thump, 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 perfectly spaced, deliberate. I'd read about this phenomenon in Bigfoot literature, reported knock communications between the creatures. I grabbed my audio recorder and captured several minutes of forest sounds. 10 minutes later, the knocks were answered by similar sounds from a different direction, further away. The hair on my arms stood up. Something intelligent was out there, communicating. The next morning, I found a cluster of branches arranged in an X pattern about 30 yards from the cabin door. The formation wasn't natural. Someone or something had deliberately placed them that way. The branches were substantial, requiring significant strength to break and position. My scientific skepticism battled with growing excitement. I'd come hoping for evidence, but what I'd found exceeded my expectations. The footprints alone were compelling, but combined with the nocturnal sounds and branch structures, the case was building towards something undeniable. For the remainder of my stay, I divided my time between tracking expeditions and nighttime observation. I set up thermal cameras around the cabin perimeter, hoping to capture movement in the darkness. Each night brought strange sounds, distant vocalizations that resembled neither human voices nor known animal calls, more wood knocks, and twice, the distinct sensation of being watched that made my skin crawl, despite the warm cabin. On my final full day in the wilderness, I made one last trip to the original track site. New prints had appeared, following roughly the same path but in the opposite direction. Whatever had made these tracks had returned through the same area. The freshness of the impressions suggested they were less than 24 hours old. I felt a conflicting mixture of excitement and frustration. All this evidence, yet not a single clear sighting of the creature itself. I'd come so close, perhaps closer than I'd ever been before, to documenting the existence of Bigfoot. That night, as I packed my equipment for departure the next morning, the forest erupted with activity. First came a series of wood knocks, closer than any before. Then a long, mournful howl that started low and rose in pitch before tapering off. The sound wasn't wolf-like or bear-like. It had a quality that was almost human, but much more powerful. My audio recorder captured it all. An hour later, something heavy moved around the cabin. Footsteps crunched in the leaf litter, circling the structure. I stood frozen in the center of the room, listening as whatever it was completed a full circuit of the cabin. It paused at the front door. The handle jiggled slightly, not enough to open it, but as if something was testing it. Then silence. I waited until morning before venturing outside. There, in the soft earth around the cabin, were more of the same massive footprints I'd been documenting all week. The creature had indeed circled the cabin multiple times. One print was perfectly preserved just below the front window, as if it had stood there, looking in at me. As I loaded the SUV with my equipment and evidence, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. I had found what I came for, compelling evidence that something unknown lives in these forests. But I was leaving with questions still unanswered. The drive back to civilization felt like returning from another world. The forest had changed me. No longer was Bigfoot just a research subject or a fascinating cryptozoological puzzle. The tracks, the sounds, the nocturnal visits all painted a picture of an intelligent, powerful being that had been aware of my presence all along. Back in my hotel room in Chilliwack, I spread my findings across the bed. 6 plaster casts of footprints, dozens of photographs, audio recordings of unexplained forest sounds, hair samples awaiting analysis, pages of field notes detailing observations and measurements. I called my colleague at the University of Idaho, Dr. Mike Connors, and described my findings. "Bring everything to the lab," he said after listening to my account. "We'll do DNA analysis on the hair samples, examine the plaster casts, and analyze the audio recordings. If what you're saying is accurate, Nathan, this could be the evidence we've been waiting for." I knew the scientific community would require more than footprints and sounds to accept the existence of Bigfoot. They would demand a body, clear photographs, or DNA that couldn't be attributed to known species. My evidence would likely be dismissed by mainstream researchers as inconclusive. But I knew what I had found. Those tracks belonged to something real, something that walked on 2 legs through the remote forests of British Columbia. Something that knocked on wood, arranged branches, and circled my cabin in the night. I carefully packed the evidence for the flight home, already planning my return expedition. Next time I would bring better equipment. Next time I would stay longer. Next time perhaps I would come face to face with the creature that had left those unforgettable footprints in the wilderness. Because now I was certain Bigfoot isn't just a legend. It's out there, watching and waiting in the ancient forests of North America, and I'm going to prove it. Story 6. My ears were still ringing from the day's music as I stared into our campfire. The flames cast dancing shadows across our small clearing, turning the surrounding forest into a wall of darkness. Thomas had just cracked open another beer, and Joey was busy scrolling through photos from today's shows on his phone. Paul poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night air. "Man, Toxic Wasteland absolutely killed it today," Thomas said, taking a long swig. "Best set of the festival so far." I nodded in agreement, my throat raw from screaming lyrics all day. This was our 4th annual trip to the Thunderhead Metal Festival, and we had our routine down pat. 3 days of headbanging, camping by the lake, and escaping our everyday lives back in Millfield. "Who's playing first tomorrow?" Paul asked, tossing his stick into the fire. "Blood Wraith at noon," Joey replied without looking up from his phone. "Then Demons—" He stopped mid-sentence, his head jerking toward the darkness behind our tent. "What?" I asked. Joey held up his hand, his eyes narrowed. "Did you hear that?" We all fell silent. The distant thump of bass from the festival's night stage was barely audible here at our campsite, which we'd deliberately set up a good quarter-mile from the main grounds for some peace when we needed it. Then I heard it too, rustling in the bushes behind our tent, followed by the snap of a twig. "Probably just a raccoon," Thomas muttered, but his body had tensed. The rustling continued, but different now, heavier. Deliberate footsteps crunched on the forest floor, circling the perimeter of our small clearing. Joey stood up, his beer forgotten. "Hey, who's there?" The footsteps stopped. We exchanged glances, the firelight playing across our uncertain faces. The music from the festival seemed even more distant now. "Probably some drunk guy who wandered off from the festival," Paul suggested with a forced laugh. "Happens every year." As if in response, the footsteps resumed, louder and closer to our camp. Whatever it was approaching from behind the darkness of the tree line. "Seriously, man, this isn't funny," Joey called out. His voice edged with irritation now. "Go back to your own campsite." Thomas reached for his flashlight, clicking it on and sweeping the beam toward the tree line. The light caught nothing but trees and underbrush. The footsteps grew closer, heavy thuds against the ground that felt too forceful, too deliberate to be a fellow camper stumbling around drunk. "That's it," Paul said, dropping his beer and standing up. "I'm checking it out." Before any of us could stop him, Paul marched toward the edge of our campsite where the footsteps had last sounded. He took 10 steps into the darkness beyond our fire's glow, then stopped abruptly. "Paul," Thomas called, "what is it?" Paul didn't answer. He just stood there, rigid, facing the darkness. I got to my feet, heart hammering in my chest. "Paul, you okay, man?" When he still didn't respond, I grabbed Thomas's flashlight and jogged over to where Paul stood frozen. As I reached him, I directed the beam into the trees. The light caught something that shouldn't have been there, something tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. It stood at least 7 feet high among the trees, partially concealed by a thick trunk. Its head was oddly shaped, almost conical at the top, and its arms hung at its sides, thick as tree limbs. The flashlight beam caught its eyes, which reflected back a reddish glow, like a predator's eyes in the night. I sucked in a breath, my hand shaking so badly the flashlight beam danced across the creature's massive form. Its forehead was high and creased with deep furrows, a flat nose jutted from its face, and I could hear a slight snorting sound with each breath it took. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of yellowed teeth, and let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. "Holy shit," I whispered, grabbing Paul's arm. "Paul, we need to—" Paul finally broke from his trance. "What? What are you—" The creature took a step forward, branches snapping under its weight. The flashlight beam fully caught its face now, inhuman, primitive, with that high forehead and those burning eyes. "Run!" I screamed, yanking Paul's arm and backpedaling toward our campfire. "Guys, run!" Joey and Thomas were already on their feet, confused but alarmed by the panic in my voice. "What the hell?" Thomas started. "There's something in the woods," I shouted, still dragging Paul with me. "We need to go, now." "What are you talking about?" Joey demanded, peering past us into the darkness. "I didn't see," Paul began, but his words cut off as another growl, louder this time, emanated from the tree line. Joey's face drained of color. "What the fuck was that?" "We need to get to the festival grounds," I insisted, already grabbing my wallet and phone from beside the fire. "There's people there. Lights." The heavy footsteps started again, faster now, crashing through underbrush. We didn't wait to see more. All 4 of us bolted, leaving our campfire burning and our tents standing. The only path led through a stretch of dark woods before reaching the well-lit festival area, and we sprinted down it blindly, branches whipping our faces. I couldn't help glancing back, and immediately wished I hadn't. The massive figure had emerged from the tree line and was standing at our abandoned campsite, its silhouette backlit by our fire. Even from this distance, I could see it was looking directly at us. "Faster!" I gasped, pushing Thomas ahead of me as he started to slow. We stumbled out of the woods and onto the dirt road that led to the festival's main entrance. The sound of music and the glow of lights ahead had never been so welcome. Security guards stood at the entrance, checking wristbands. "Dude, what happened to you guys?" one of the guards asked as we stumbled up, gasping for breath, sweat pouring down our faces despite the cool night air. There's something in the woods," I panted, pointing back the way we had come. The guard exchanged a glance with his colleague. "Yeah, it's called beer, and maybe some substances I'm not supposed to know about," he said with a smirk. "You guys need water?" "No, listen," Joey insisted, his voice cracking. "There's actually something out there, like something big, not human." The guards' expressions made it clear they didn't believe a word. They'd probably heard every drug-induced festival story imaginable. "Whatever you say, man," the second guard replied, waving us through. Just try to take it easy on whatever you're on." We pushed our way into the festival grounds, where hundreds of metalheads were still enjoying the late-night acts. The crush of bodies and the blaring music would normally have been comforting, familiar territory. But tonight, it just added to my disorientation. "What the hell did we just see?" Thomas asked once we had found a relatively quiet spot near one of the merchandise tents. "I don't know," I admitted, my hands still shaking. "But it was real. You saw it too, right, Paul?" Paul shook his head. "I didn't actually see anything. I just heard it. And then you freaked out and we ran." "Because there was something there," I insisted. A thing. Like a man, but not. Huge, with those eyes." "I believe you," Joey said quietly. "I caught a glimpse when you shone the flashlight. It wasn't normal." We stood in silence for a moment, the bass from the nearby stage thumping through the ground. "We need to report this," Thomas finally said, "to the festival security or maybe the local cops." I laughed bitterly. "And tell them what? That we saw a monster in the woods? They'll think we're high out of our minds, just like those guards did." As if to confirm my point, a commotion broke out near one of the entrance gates. A group of 3 campers had burst in, their faces pale with fear, gesturing wildly to the security team. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the music, but their expressions and frantic pointing toward the woods told me everything I needed to know. "Looks like we weren't the only ones," Joey murmured. We watched as the security team shook their heads, obviously dismissing whatever the group was saying. One guard made a drinking motion with his hand, and his colleagues laughed. For the next hour, we stayed in the crowded, well-lit festival area, jumping at every sudden movement or sound. I kept scanning the perimeter, half expecting to see that massive figure emerge from between the parked cars or vendor tents. Around 2 a.m., the main stages shut down, and people began filing toward the campgrounds or to their vehicles. The 4 of us huddled together, faced with a decision. "We can't go back to our tents," I stated flatly. "Not tonight." No one argued. "Our stuff is still there," Thomas pointed out. "Everything except what we have in our pockets." "It can stay there," Joey replied. "I'm not going back in those woods until daylight, if then." "Let's sleep in the car," Paul suggested. "At least we'll be locked in, and the parking lot is guarded and lit." It was our only real option. We made our way to the parking field where Thomas's old Suburban was waiting. The lot was still fairly busy with people coming and going, some heading home after the day's shows, others grabbing supplies from their vehicles. As we approached the car, I noticed a small crowd gathered near the edge of the parking area, where the lot bordered the same stretch of forest that contained our campsite. People were pointing into the trees, their voices carrying in the night air. I swear to God it was right there. "Bullshit, man, you're wasted. I'm telling you, it was huge, like not human huge. Did you see the eyes? They were glowing." My stomach dropped. I exchanged looks with Joey, whose face had gone pale again. "Get in the car," I whispered. "Now." We piled into Thomas's Suburban, locking the doors immediately. Through the windows I could see more people gathering at the forest's edge, some laughing and recording on their phones, others backing away with genuine fear on their faces. "They're seeing it too," Joey said, his voice barely audible. We watched as festival security arrived, shining powerful flashlights into the trees. They were clearly humoring the crowd, making a show of investigating while smirking among themselves. Then one of the beams caught something moving in the darkness, just for a split second, but it was enough to wipe the smile off the security guard's face. He took a step back, said something to his radio, and motioned for the crowd to move away from the tree line. "Holy shit," Thomas breathed, pressing his face against the window. "They saw it." More security arrived, along with what looked like festival management. They formed a line, pushing the curious crowd back toward the parking lot center, away from the woods. The flashlights continued to sweep the trees, but whatever had been there seemed to have retreated deeper into the forest. We spent a miserable night in that car, cramped and uncomfortable, jumping at every sound. None of us slept more than a few minutes at a time. Thomas kept the doors locked and the keys in the ignition, ready to drive away at the first sign of trouble. As the first grey light of dawn broke over the festival grounds, we debated our next move. "We need to go back and get our stuff," Paul said. "We can't just leave everything." "I'm not going alone," Joey replied. "We all go together, grab what we can, and get the hell out of here." No one argued. As soon as it was fully light, we cautiously made our way back to our campsite, staying on the main paths and keeping a wary eye on the surrounding woods. Our camp was exactly as we'd left it. The fire had long since burned out, and morning dew covered our tents and gear. There was no sign that anything unusual had been there, no footprints or disturbed earth that might confirm what we'd seen. "Maybe we imagined it," Thomas suggested half-heartedly as we quickly packed our things. "Mass hallucination or something." I didn't respond, just focused on stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack as fast as possible. But as I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something on the ground near where we had first spotted the creature, a tuft of coarse, dark hair caught on a low branch. Hair that didn't look like it came from any animal I recognized. I left it there. Some questions are better left unanswered. We packed the car in record time and were on the road before most of the festival was even awake. Thomas drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Joey sat beside him, constantly checking the rearview mirror. Paul and I were in the back, surrounded by our hastily packed gear. "We're never talking about this again," Thomas finally said, as we merged onto the highway, putting miles between us and whatever lurked in those woods. "Agreed." "Agreed," we all echoed. But I knew we were lying to ourselves. Whatever we had seen that night by the campfire would haunt our memories forever. And I knew with absolute certainty that none of us would ever return to Thunderhead Festival again. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that those burning red eyes were still watching us, even now, waiting for the next group of campers who would wander too far from the safety of the lights, too close to whatever ancient thing called those woods home. Story 7. My name is Emily Davidson, and I've spent 39 years trying to forget what happened that night in April 1984. I was 17 then, living with my family in West Hawk Lake, Manitoba. Our house sat on the edge of Whiteshell Provincial Park, where my dad worked for the Department of Natural Resources. Most days I loved our location, surrounded by dense forest, crystalline lakes, and granite ridges that looked like the bones of the earth pushed up through the soil. But after that night, I couldn't look at those woods the same way again. Grace, Melanie, and Patty had come over for a Friday night sleepover. We'd been friends since elementary school, a tight-knit group bonded by growing up in the isolation of rural Manitoba. Dad had finished the basement the previous summer, putting in wood paneling, a small bathroom, and enough space for us to spread out sleeping bags without bumping into each other. Mum had even let us drag the old TV down there. It felt like our own private apartment. We did the usual teenage girl stuff that night. Painted our nails, talked about boys from school, watched a terrible horror movie on VHS that Melanie had smuggled from her older brother's collection. By midnight, we'd demolished 2 large pizzas and a bag of chips. Mom and Dad had gone to bed upstairs hours earlier, and my little brother Trent was supposedly sleeping over at his friend Kevin's house. "I can't believe your parents trust us down here by ourselves," Patty said, combing her long blonde hair in front of the small mirror we'd propped against the wall. "They're just up the stairs," I said, "and Dad would wake up if a mouse farted in the attic. He's paranoid about forest fires and break-ins." Grace laughed. "My dad sleeps through thunderstorms. Last summer, Lightning hit our shed and he didn't even roll over. We switched off the TV around 12:30, leaving just the small lamp in the corner on. The basement had 3 small windows at ground level, each about 2 feet square, letting in slivers of moonlight around the edges of the curtains Dad had installed. We arranged our sleeping bags in a row on the floor and settled in, still giggling and whispering. I must have dozed off for a bit. The digital clock on the VCR read 1:06 a.m. when I first heard it. A soft, deliberate scratching at one of the windows. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. I sat up, and the sound immediately stopped. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered. The others were breathing deeply, apparently asleep. I stared at the window, seeing nothing but darkness behind the thin curtain. After a minute of silence, I convinced myself it was just a branch or maybe a raccoon. I lay back down. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound resumed the moment my head hit the pillow. I froze, heart suddenly racing. I sat up again, and again the scratching stopped instantly. Whatever was making that noise could see me. It knew when I moved. "Guys," I whispered more urgently, "wake up. There's something at the window." Melanie stirred. "What?" "Listen." We sat in silence for 30 seconds. Nothing happened. "I don't hear anything," Melanie mumbled, rolling over. "Just lie back down," I told her. "Wait and listen." She complied, and within seconds the scratching returned, more insistent now and at 2 windows simultaneously. Melanie bolted upright. "What the hell?" The scratching stopped. "See?" I said. "It knows when we move." Grace and Patty were awake now too. "What's going on?" Patty asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Someone's outside," I explained. "They're scratching at the windows, but they stop when we sit up." "It's probably Trent and Kevin," Grace said, rubbing her eyes. "Didn't you say they were supposed to be at Kevin's? They probably snuck back to scare us." That made sense. My brother was 14 and thought scaring girls was the height of comedy. Just last month, he'd hidden in my closet and jumped out when I came in to change, nearly giving me a heart attack. "You're right," I said. "That little jerk." We waited, and sure enough, the scratching resumed, louder now, more deliberate. It had moved to all 3 windows. "They must have Kevin and some other guys with them," Melanie whispered. "That's at least 3 people. Let's turn the tables on them," I suggested, feeling a mix of relief and annoyance. "Act scared, then jump out and chase them. They'll run screaming like babies." We giggled at the plan, then put on our best terrified faces. "Oh my God, what is that?" Patty called out dramatically. "I'm so scared," Grace added, hamming it up. The scratching intensified, becoming faster and more aggressive. The sound changed from fingernails on glass to something that sounded harder, like claws or tools. Then we heard something that didn't fit our theory about Trent and his friends. A low growl, barely audible but unmistakably animal, came from outside the largest window. "What was that?" Melanie whispered, no longer acting. Before anyone could answer, a tremendous bang shook the root cellar door on the far side of the basement. The door was old and heavy, set into the concrete foundation and leading outside via concrete steps. Dad kept it bolted from the inside, using it only to bring firewood in during winter months. Bang! Bang! Something was hitting the door with incredible force. "Jesus!" Patty squeaked. "Maybe it's a bear," Grace suggested, her voice trembling. "They come out of hibernation in April." The banging continued, each impact making the door shudder in its frame. I could hear the metal bolt straining. "This isn't funny anymore, Trent," I shouted, hoping desperately it was still my brother. The only response was another growl, louder this time, followed by more frantic scratching at all 3 windows simultaneously. "I'm going to look," Grace said suddenly, moving toward the nearest window. "Don't!" I hissed, but she was already pulling back the edge of the curtain. For a second she stood frozen, peering out. Then she let out a scream and stumbled backward, falling onto her sleeping bag. "There's something out there," she gasped. "Something big." At that moment, The window exploded inward. Glass shattered across the floor as something massive slammed against the opening. The curtain ripped away, and I saw it. A face pressed against the broken window, huge and white and covered in coarse hair. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human. It looked almost like a monkey, but far larger than any primate I'd ever seen in books or at the zoo. And its eyes, God, its eyes were bright, luminous green, glowing in the dim light like those of a cat, but much bigger. Despite the animal features, those eyes looked intelligent, almost human. The thing let out a sound I'll never forget, a scream of pure rage that started like a roar and ended in a high-pitched howl. All four of us screamed in response, huddling together in the center of the room as far from the windows and cellar door as possible. The creature pulled back from the window, and for a split second I thought it was leaving. Then the banging on the cellar door resumed with redoubled fury. The bolt was visibly bending now, the wood around it splintering. "Dad!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. "Dad! Help us!" We heard thumping footsteps upstairs, then the basement door flying open. Dad appeared on the stairs in his pajama bottoms, holding his shotgun. "What the hell is happening?" he shouted. "There's something trying to get in," I cried, pointing at the cellar door and the broken window. Dad rushed to the bottom of the stairs, sweeping the room with his shotgun raised. The banging and scratching had stopped the instant he appeared. "Stay together," he ordered, moving toward the broken window. He peered out cautiously, then checked the cellar door. The bolt was bent almost to the breaking point, and deep gouges marked the wood around the frame. "All of you upstairs now," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Go to the living room." We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled up the stairs to find Mom standing in the hallway in her nightgown, looking terrified. "What's happening?" she asked. "Something tried to break in," Patty sobbed. "It broke the window." Mom looked pale but composed. "Into the living room, girls. Stay away from the windows." We huddled on the couch while Mom pulled all the curtains closed and turned on every light in the house. Dad came up a few minutes later, his face grim. "Did you see it?" I asked. "It's gone now," he said, avoiding the question. He looked at Mom. "I'm going to stay down there for the night. The window's busted, and that door almost gave." Mom nodded, then turned to us. "Tell me exactly what you saw." We took turns describing the scratching, the banging, and finally the face at the window. "It was white," Grace said, "like albino white with hair all over." "And those eyes," Melanie added, shuddering. "Green, like glow sticks." "It wasn't human," I said firmly, "but it wasn't just an animal either. It knew what it was doing. It could see us." I expected Mum to question us, to suggest we'd imagined things or exaggerated in our fear. Instead, she and Dad exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "You girls should try to get some sleep," Mum said finally. "You can all stay in Emily's room. I'll bring up some extra blankets." "What was it, Dad?" I pressed. "Probably just a bear," he said, not meeting my eyes. "They get aggressive in spring when they're hungry. I'll call the DNR in the morning." He was lying. I could tell immediately. Dad never had a poker face. But before I could challenge him, he headed back downstairs with his shotgun, a hammer and some plywood from the garage to cover the broken window. None of us slept that night. We lay in my bedroom, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. At dawn, I heard Dad's truck start up. When I looked out my window, I saw him driving slowly around the property, scanning the tree line. After breakfast, Mum convinced my friend's parents to come pick them up early. While Dad was talking to Patty's father in the driveway, I snuck down to examine the basement. The cellar door bolt was bent almost double, but what made my skin crawl were the marks on the outside of the door, visible through the broken window. 4 deep parallel gashes in the wood, each about an inch wide, spaced like fingers on a hand, but too large to be human. When I came back upstairs, I overheard Mom on the phone. "It came back, Tom," she was saying quietly. "Yes, the same thing. The girls saw it this time. I know we agreed not to talk about it, but she noticed me and quickly ended the call. "Mom," I said firmly, "what's going on? What came back?" She sighed heavily and sat down at the kitchen table. "Sit down, Emily." I did, my heart pounding. "Your father and we've seen it before, 3 winters ago, when you were staying at your grandmother's for that weekend." "Seen what?" "We don't know exactly what it is," she said carefully. "Some people around here call it a Sasquatch, but it's not like the ones you hear about in stories. This one's white, and it seems interested in our house." "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded. "We didn't want to frighten you, and we thought it was gone. It hasn't been around for years." Dad came in then, his face haggard from the sleepless night. "Found tracks heading east," he told Mom, seemingly forgetting I was there. "Bigger than last time, must be 7 feet tall now." "7 feet?" I gasped. Dad looked at me, then at Mom. "You told her." "She deserves to know, Bill. All 4 girls saw it." Dad sat down heavily. "After last time, I talked to some of the old-timers at the DNR. They've heard stories for decades. White creature, green eyes. Some think it's a type of Sasquatch, but different from the brown ones people report seeing in the mountains out west. It's intelligent," I said. "It knew when we could see it. It was testing the windows, looking for a way in." Dad nodded grimly. "That's what scares me most. It's not just an animal acting on instinct. It's planning, thinking." Within a week, Dad had installed heavy security bars on all the basement windows and reinforced the cellar door with steel plates. He also put in motion-activated floodlights around the entire house. The white creature never returned while I lived there, but its visit changed everything. We were never allowed to sleep in the basement again. Dad enforced a strict rule about being inside before dark. He started keeping his shotgun loaded and within reach at all times. My friends and I made a pact never to talk about what we'd seen. In a small town like West Hawk Lake, we'd have been labeled as either liars or lunatics. But we knew what we saw. In all the years since, I've researched strange creatures and unexplained phenomena. I've read accounts of Bigfoot and wild men and forest spirits from across North America. Nothing quite matches what visited us that night. Years later, after I'd moved away to Carbondale, Pennsylvania for college, I was shocked to hear locals there talking about occasional sightings of what they called the white thing in the forests outside town. Same description. Massive, white-haired with unnatural green eyes. I never told them I'd seen it too. Sometimes when I visit my parents, they still live in that same house, though Dad has since retired. I catch them staring watchfully at the tree line at dusk. They never talk about it anymore, but they still lock up carefully at night, and Dad's shotgun still stays within reach. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in my childhood room during those visits, I think I hear a faint scratching at the window. I never look. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. Some memories are better left undisturbed, like the dark woods beyond the reach of our floodlights, where things we don't understand watch and wait. Story 8. The wind bit through my tactical gear as I trudged through knee-deep snow, leading my A-team through the Alaskan wilderness. March 1988. Temperature hovering around 15 degrees below zero. My breath formed clouds in front of my face, disappearing into the vast whiteness surrounding us. "Hold up!" I called, raising my fist in the air, the universal military signal to stop. My men halted behind me, their labored breathing the only sound in the silent forest. I'm Commander William Reynolds, Green Berets, leading a strategic reconnaissance training mission in what felt like the most God-forsaken corner of Alaska. The purpose: cold weather survival and stealth movement in harsh terrain. We'd been at it for 3 days, pushing ourselves to the limit, as any Special Forces team should. Staff Sergeant Mike Calloway and Corporal Pete Jenkins flanked me as we scouted our path forward. Both were seasoned operators, Calloway with 2 tours in Central America under his belt, Jenkins fresh from specialized mountain warfare training. "Commander, check this out," Jenkins said, pointing toward the ground about 20 yards ahead. I stepped forward, squinting at what appeared to be tracks crossing our intended route at a perpendicular angle. The three of us approached cautiously, military instinct kicking in despite this being a training exercise. What I saw stopped me cold. "Those aren't bear tracks," Calloway muttered, crouching down. The impressions in the snow showed a clear bipedal gait, 2 feet walking upright, but these weren't normal human footprints, not even close. "Look at the stride length," I said, measuring with my eyes. "That's over 5 feet between steps." Jenkins nodded. "And they barely sink into the snow." He was right. Our own tracks plunged deep into the powder, with clear drag marks where our boots pushed through the snow. These mysterious tracks showed a clean impression without the surrounding disturbance our movement created. I pulled out my field notebook and started documenting what we found. The prints themselves measured around 17 inches long and 8 inches wide. The depth was minimal compared to our own tracks, despite the creature's obviously larger size. "Based on stride length, foot size and impression depth," I said, "we're looking at something bipedal, approximately 9 feet tall, weighing over 600 pounds. Calloway ran his gloved finger along the edge of one print. "These are fresh. Maybe 2-3 hours old at most." I felt a surge of curiosity that overrode my mission parameters. "Let's follow them, just for a bit." My men exchanged glances but nodded. As special forces, we were trained to gather intelligence on unknown situations. This certainly qualified. We adjusted our course and began tracking the prints, maintaining tactical spacing. The forest around us grew denser, the snow deeper. Our progress slowed as we documented the creature's path, noting how it moved through the terrain with surprising efficiency. "Commander," Jenkins said after about 40 minutes of tracking, "notice how it's using the terrain." I'd already noted it in my field book. The tracks showed the creature traversing ridge lines at saddles, the lowest points between peaks, to remain hidden from observation. It bypassed clearings well before coming into view of them, sticking to dense tree cover. "Military-grade tactical movement," I confirmed. "It's using the land to conceal itself." "From what?" Calloway asked. "Bears? Wolves?" "From us," I said simply. "Humans." We pressed on for another 20 minutes. The temperature dropped further as clouds gathered overhead, threatening more snow. We were about an hour into our detour when it happened. A sound cut through the forest, starting low, then building to a crescendo that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't a wolf howl or bear roar, but something that contained elements of both. The sound echoed between the trees, bouncing off the mountains surrounding us. Then silence. Complete and absolute silence. No birds, no wind rustling branches, nothing. I turned to Calloway and saw something I'd never seen before in our years serving together through firefights and covert operations. Genuine fear. "Commander," he said, voice steady despite the look in his eyes, "we need to fall back to the original route." Jenkins nodded emphatically. "Agreed, sir." I surveyed the terrain ahead. The tracks led toward a heavily wooded area where visibility would be severely limited. We carried only training weapons with blank rounds, standard procedure for these exercises. If we encountered something aggressive weighing 600 pounds, we'd have no effective defense. "All right," I conceded. "We return to mission parameters. And gentlemen, this stays between us for now." Both men nodded, relief evident on their faces. We turned around, retracing our steps with increased vigilance. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush drew our immediate attention. The three of us maintained a triangle formation, covering all angles as we moved. Back at our rendezvous point, the rest of the team waited, having set up a temporary camp. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached as we emerged from the tree line. "Find a good route, Commander?" he asked. I nodded. "We've got our path forward. Pack it up in 15. We move out before this weather turns." That night, as the team settled into our snow shelters, I lay awake replaying the day's events. The tactical movement patterns troubled me most. This wasn't random animal behavior. The creature, whatever it was, used the same principles we taught in advanced evasion techniques. The next morning brought clearer skies and a punishing cold that seeped into our bones. We continued our training mission, focusing on our objectives, but I couldn't shake the encounter from my mind. 3 days later, as we prepared to exit the field, I pulled Calloway and Jenkins aside. When we return to base, we file our reports as standard, I instructed them. No mention of the tracks or what we heard. Why, sir? Jenkins asked. Shouldn't we report it? I considered his question carefully. What we saw was something moving through its own territory, actively avoiding human contact, demonstrating intelligence and tactical awareness. If we report it, what happens next? Research teams? Hunting parties? Calloway nodded slowly. I get it. We'd be putting a target on its back. Exactly, I said. Whatever's out there has managed to stay hidden for good reason. Let's respect that. We completed our extraction the following day, returning to base with the expected training documentation and nothing more. The incident remained unrecorded in any official capacity. Years passed. I rotated through different commands, eventually retiring from active duty in 2003. The Alaska encounter faded into the background of more immediate concerns: combat deployments, training cycles, family life. Until one evening in September 2007, when my phone rang at my home in rural Montana. "Commander Reynolds?" a familiar voice asked. "Calloway," I said, recognizing him immediately despite the years. "Haven't been commander for a while now." "Old habits," he replied. "Listen, I'm calling because something happened that reminded me of Alaska. 88. I closed the door to my study, suddenly alert. "Go on." "I'm working Forest Service now, north of Yellowstone. 2 hikers went missing last week. We found them yesterday, alive, but scared out of their minds. They described being stalked by something big that moved through the trees, said it herded them away from their intended path, keeping to ridgelines, using tactics." My mind flashed back to those tracks in the Alaskan snow. Similar movement patterns. "Identical," Calloway confirmed, and they recorded a sound on their cell phone. "Same hybrid howl roar we heard. The recording is making the rounds among the search teams, but everyone's calling it a bear or wolf interaction." "But you know better," I said. "We both do," he replied. "I thought you should know it's not just in Alaska." After hanging up, I pulled out an old lockbox from my closet. Inside was the field notebook from that mission. Unofficial notes I'd kept for myself. The detailed measurements of the prints, the stride length calculations, the terrain observations. I'd drawn a rough map of the creature's evasion route, noting how it had used natural features for concealment. 2 weeks after Calloway's call, I drove to meet him in a small diner in Cook City, Montana. He looked older, grayer, but the same sharp intelligence remained in his eyes. "Brought you something," he said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. Inside were photographs, plaster casts of large humanoid footprints found near where the hikers had been recovered. 17 inches, I noted, measuring with a pocket ruler. Calloway nodded. "Same stride length too, proportionally. Whatever this is, it's widespread but stays hidden. Uses the same movement techniques regardless of location. Learned behavior, I suggested. Passed down, maybe. Or intelligent adaptation," Calloway countered. "Either way, it knows how to avoid us." We spent the afternoon comparing notes, analyzing the evidence from both encounters. The similarities were undeniable, not just the physical attributes, but the behavioral patterns, the tactical awareness, the deliberate avoidance. "What do we do with this information?" Calloway asked finally. I considered the question carefully. "Nothing," I decided, "just like in 88. Whatever these creatures are, they're not threatening humans unprovoked. They're avoiding contact, using sophisticated methods to remain undetected. Sasquatch, Calloway said, using the term we'd both avoided until now. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? A highly intelligent, tactical species that successfully evaded documented human contact despite our technology and expansion, I replied. Call it what you want. Before leaving, I handed Calloway a sealed envelope. If anything happens to me, open this. It contains everything I documented from Alaska and my analysis since then. But until that day comes, let's keep this between us. He nodded, understanding the gravity of the information. In the years since that meeting, I've collected reports of similar encounters across North America. Not the sensational stories that make tabloid headlines, but the quiet accounts from military personnel, forest service workers, and experienced outdoorsmen who know what they saw wasn't conventional wildlife. The pattern is always the same: tactical movement, avoidance rather than confrontation, and the intelligent use of terrain. These aren't the behaviors of a simple animal. They represent something more, something that deserves respect. I think often about that day in Alaska, about the tracks in the snow and the sound that silenced the forest. I think about how something weighing 600 pounds could move with such stealth and purpose. Most of all, I think about the intelligence it displayed, navigating its world with the same tactical awareness we spend years training our best soldiers to develop. Whatever we encountered that day in 1988 wasn't just a cryptid or legend. It was a thinking, adapting species that has mastered the art of coexistence through avoidance. In all my years of military service, facing human adversaries across multiple continents, I never encountered anything that evaded detection with such skill. That's why I've kept this quiet all these years. Not out of fear of ridicule, but out of respect for a species that has made it clear it wants nothing to do with us. They've earned their privacy through their remarkable ability to maintain it in an increasingly monitored world. Sometimes at night, standing on my porch overlooking the Montana wilderness, I imagine them out there, moving silently between ridge lines, navigating by starlight, using the terrain to remain forever just out of sight. And I hope they stay that way, for their sake and ours, because some things in this world deserve to remain undiscovered, especially when they've worked so hard to keep it that way. Story 9. I never considered myself superstitious. 20 years hauling freight across the lower 48 teaches you that the real monsters are the ones driving four-wheelers who cut you off without signaling. At least that's what I thought until that summer night in '91. The digital clock on my dash read 11:37 p.m. when I pulled into the rest area just past mile marker 157 on I-90 in South Dakota. My logbook showed I'd been pushing 16 hours, well past regulation, but the shipping company was offering a fat bonus for on-time delivery to Portland. I needed that money for Melissa's braces back home. Rest areas like this one were a dime a dozen across the country. This particular stop was smaller than most, just a cinder block building with restrooms, vending machines, and shower facilities for professional drivers. The parking lot had spaces for maybe 20 vehicles, but tonight I counted only 3 others. A station wagon with Minnesota plates, an old Buick, and a blue Peterbilt parked under the single functioning light in the lot. I pulled my Kenworth into an empty space and shut down the engine. The sudden silence hit me like a physical presence. No traffic sounds reached here, just the faint hum of the soda machine and an occasional rustle from the dense pine forest pressing in on 3 sides of the facility. The desk attendant barely looked up when I entered. Skinny guy, maybe 60, with tobacco-stained fingers and thinning grey hair. His name tag read Earl. "Shower tokens $5, he mumbled, without looking up from his crossword puzzle. Vending machines got sandwiches, coffee makers busted. I slid a 5 across the counter. "Anyone else working tonight?" Earl snorted. Just me till morning shift at 6. Highway department cut our budget again. The shower helped wake me up enough to eat a stale turkey sandwich from the vending machine. I checked the payphone. Out of order. No cell signal either. This place was truly in the middle of nowhere. I decided to park around back where it was quieter. The rear lot was empty and backed up directly to the tree line. I could see nothing beyond the first few feet of pines before absolute darkness took over. I backed my rig up until I was maybe 20 feet from the woods, pulled the curtains on my sleeper, and settled in for a few hours of shut-eye. Sleep came quickly, but didn't last. The first howl jolted me awake at 1:24 a.m. It wasn't a wolf. I'd heard wolves before in my routes through Minnesota and northern Michigan. This was different, deeper, more guttural, with an almost human-like quality at the end. The sound echoed across the lot, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. I sat up, fully awake now, and peered through my curtains. The security light in the lot cast long shadows, but nothing moved out there. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it must have been a coyote with a weird call and laid back down. The second howl came 20 minutes later, closer this time. Close enough that I felt the vibration in my chest. This wasn't just loud, it had physical presence. The call started low, almost subsonic, then rose to a pitch that made my teeth ache before dropping into that same human-like groan at the end. I reached for the .38 Special I kept in my glove compartment. Illegal while crossing state lines, but invaluable on lonely stretches of highway. The weight of it in my hand provided some comfort as I stared out into the darkness. Nothing moved. Not even wind in the trees. The third howl never fully materialized. Instead, it started as that same bass rumble, then cut off abruptly. Something had interrupted whatever was making that sound. The next hour passed in tense silence. I didn't sleep. Just sat there with my back against the cab wall, gun in hand, straining to hear anything beyond the occasional tick of my engine cooling. Around 3 a.m., headlights swept across my mirrors as another truck pulled into the back lot. A white Freightliner with Ohio plates parked about 50 feet away, angled toward the building rather than the woods. Seeing another trucker brought immediate relief. Safety in numbers, I figured. I watched as the driver's side door opened and a heavy-set man in a flannel shirt climbed down. He looked around nervously, then hurried inside the rest area building. With another person nearby, I finally dozed off again, gun still in hand. The banging on my door yanked me from sleep. Dawn was just breaking, grey light filtering through my curtains. The clock read 5:37 a.m. The Ohio trucker stood outside my cab, face pale, gesturing frantically for me to roll down my window. His eyes kept darting toward the woods behind my truck. I cracked the window. "What's the problem, buddy?" "Don't get out," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "For God's sake, stay in your truck." "What are you—" The impact came from behind, rocking my entire rig forward violently. The front tires actually left the ground for a split second before slamming back down. My head snapped back against the seat, sending pain shooting down my spine. The other trucker scrambled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell was that?" I shouted. But my voice was drowned out by a sound I'll never forget. A deep, rumbling growl mixed with something like a human moan. It came from directly behind my trailer. The Ohio driver was already running for his truck. "It's back!" he yelled. "Start your engine and get the hell out." I reached for the keys with shaking hands, but before I could turn the ignition, another impact slammed into the side of my sleeper cab. The entire truck shifted sideways several feet. Metal screamed as something powerful dented the exterior wall inward. The impact knocked my gun to the floor. I scrambled for it, heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the Ohio trucker was already pulling away, tires spinning on the asphalt. He never looked back. Another strike hit the rear doors of my trailer, hard enough that I felt the shock through the fifth wheel connection. Whatever was out there was trying to get in, or trying to flip me over. Panic seized me. I couldn't see what was attacking my rig. The mirrors showed nothing but empty lot and trees, but something massive was out there, something strong enough to rock a fully loaded 18-wheeler. The next impact came from the side again, this time against the cab door. The metal buckled inward, the window frame distorting. I scrambled to the passenger side, gun raised toward the driver's door, waiting for it to tear open. But it didn't. Instead, there was silence. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. Then I did something stupid, something I can't explain even now. I yelled, "What do you want?" My voice echoed in the empty cab, then silence again. Complete silence. Whatever was out there had stopped. I waited 5 minutes, barely breathing, gun trained on the door. Nothing happened. Slowly, I moved back to the driver's seat. The keys were still in the ignition. I turned them with trembling fingers, and the diesel engine roared to life. The headlights cut through the early morning mist. I put the truck in gear, planning to pull forward and around to the front lot, where there were lights and possibly other people. That's when I saw it. A massive shape lumbered across my headlight beams about 30 feet ahead. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It walked upright on 2 legs, but it wasn't human. It stood at least 12 feet tall, covered in thick, matted hair or fur that looked reddish-brown in the headlights. It moved with a fluid grace that defied its size, covering ground with impossible speed. In 3 strides, it reached the edge of the forest, then it stopped and turned. Even now, 27 years later, I can feel those eyes. They were set deep in a face that was neither human nor animal, but something in between. Intelligent, aware, looking directly at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My finger was frozen on the trigger of a gun that suddenly seemed absurdly inadequate. For 3 eternal seconds we stared at each other. Then it turned and vanished into the trees with shocking speed, branches swaying in its wake. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, engine idling, unable to process what I'd seen. Eventually, basic survival instinct kicked in. I needed to get out of there. But first I had to see the damage. I chambered around in the 38, exited the cab, and walked slowly around my rig. What I found made my blood run cold. The driver's side door was caved inward, the metal warped and buckled as if hit by a wrecking ball. The back doors of my trailer showed similar damage. Massive dents that pushed the metal inward nearly a foot. One of the hinges had snapped completely. But it was the other evidence that truly terrified me. Embedded in the dented metal were clear impressions, outlines of what could only be described as massive fingers. And on the ground, near the rear of the trailer, sunk deep into the soft asphalt, was a footprint. It looked vaguely human, but was nearly 24 inches long. I didn't wait for Earl or the morning shift. I climbed back in my cab, threw the transmission into gear, and left rubber on the pavement getting out of there. I drove non-stop to the next truck stop 90 miles west, hands shaking the entire time. When I finally pulled in, I called my dispatcher with some bullshit story about hitting a guardrail. They weren't happy, but the load was intact, and that's all they really cared about. For years, I told no one the full story. Who would believe it? I rerouted all my future hauls to avoid South Dakota completely, even when it meant longer trips and less pay. Then in 2003, at a truck stop outside of Reno, I overheard another driver describing an encounter near the same stretch of I-90. His story matched mine in too many details to be coincidence. The howls, the attacks on his vehicle, the massive figure disappearing into the woods. His name was Ted Granger, from Pikeville, Kentucky. We talked until sunrise. He showed me pictures of his truck after the encounter, the same distinctive dent patterns I'd seen on mine. Ted had already connected with others online who had similar experiences. They called the creature Ridgewalker and documented dozens of sightings along that corridor. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived it. All I know is what I saw, what I heard, what happened to my truck that night. I still drive long haul, 27 years on the job now. I've seen plenty of strange things on America's highways. ghost lights in the Arizona desert, phantom hitchhikers in the Pacific Northwest, even what some might call UFOs over the Nevada flatlands. But nothing compares to what I encountered that night in South Dakota. Nothing makes my blood run cold like the memory of those eyes staring into mine, recognizing me, seeing me as clearly as I saw it. I keep a journal now of unusual sightings along my routes. There are patterns emerging, clusters of encounters in remote areas, often near boundaries between wilderness and civilization. The ridgewalker isn't alone out there. Most truckers won't talk about these things. We have a reputation to maintain, after all. But late at night, when it's just a few old-timers in the back booth of some highway diner, the stories come out, and they all start the same way mine does. I never believed in any of this until the interstate highway system spans over 46,000 miles across America. I've driven most of it, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, we don't know what's out there, watching from the tree lines as we pass by, venturing out when darkness falls. I still drive at night, still stop at remote rest areas when my hours demand it, but I never ever park near the woods. And when I hear howling in the distance, I start my engine and move on, no matter what my logbook says. Some places aren't meant for us. Some creatures weren't meant to be seen, and some nights, like that one in South Dakota, remind us that we aren't the apex predator we think we are. Name's Daniel Morgan. That's my story. Believe it or don't, makes no difference to me. Just watch the woods next time you stop at a rest area after dark. And if you hear howling, drive. Don't look back, just drive. Story 10. My head was throbbing. Blood trickled down my temple as consciousness slowly returned. The steering wheel had caught me square in the forehead when my pickup spun out. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. Everything was sideways. No, my truck was. I'd landed in a ditch off the highway, the passenger side tilted down at a steep angle. Shit, I muttered, touching my forehead and wincing at the sticky wetness. I'd been driving for about 2.5 hours when my old Chevy started making that awful sputtering noise. Dad had warned me about taking this heap on a long trip, but what choice did I have? The camping gear in the truck bed was all new, my graduation present, but the truck itself was ancient, handed down from my Uncle Bobby. I'd been so focused on the sputtering engine that I barely registered the blown tire until it was too late. The pickup had spun wildly, and then blackness. How long had I been out? Minutes? Hours? The watch on my wrist showed 4:37 p.m. I'd left home around 1, so not too long. That's when I felt it, a vibration running through the entire truck. Then another, like something heavy was moving around outside. A low, guttural growl filtered through the closed windows. It wasn't a sound I recognized, not a bear, not a wolf, not anything I'd ever heard in the Washington wilderness before. Heavy breathing followed, the kind that fogs up glass on a cold day. But it wasn't cold. It was July 17th, 1998, and the summer heat was intense. The truck shook again. Something was back there messing with my stuff in the bed. I tried to turn, but pain shot through my neck. Using the rearview mirror instead, I caught glimpses of movement, something big, really big. Ignoring the pain, I twisted in my seat for a better look. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. Standing behind my truck was what could only be described as a Sasquatch, a fucking Bigfoot, 12 feet tall at least, covered in reddish-brown matted fur, with shoulders wider than my truck bed. Its massive arms hung down to its knees, ending in hands with fingers the size of bananas. "No way," I whispered. "No fucking way." The creature paced behind the vehicle, its movements surprisingly fluid for something so massive. It would take 3 strides away, then 3 back, like it was thinking, planning. Suddenly it charged, slamming its weight against the truck. My pickup rocked violently, the suspension groaning in protest. I gripped the steering wheel, heart hammering against my ribs. It hit the truck again, and I realized it was trying to get to me. The cab. It wanted inside. After several unsuccessful attempts, the beast changed tactics. It reached into the truck bed and grabbed my brand new REI equipment bag. With terrifying ease, it ripped through the heavy-duty canvas like it was tissue paper. My gear spilled out. Cooking equipment, flashlights, tent poles clattering against the metal bed. The creature paused, seemed to sniff the air, then reached for my food sack. It tore that open too, spilling packages of dehydrated meals, energy bars, and trail mix across the truck bed. With clumsy fingers, it picked up a package of beef jerky, turning it over with what looked like curiosity. It tried to bite through the packaging, but struggled. Frustrated, it tossed the jerky aside and grabbed a water bottle. Those massive fingers crushed the plastic, sending water spraying everywhere. This seemed to agitate it further. The growling grew louder, and it began throwing my possessions in all directions. My sleeping bag sailed into the trees. My first aid kit burst open against a rock, scattering bandages and antiseptic wipes across the dirt. Then suddenly it stopped. The creature turned and looked directly at my window. I ducked down, but it was too late. It had seen me. In 3 massive strides, it was at my door, peering in through the glass. I pressed myself against the opposite door, as far away as possible in the confined space. Its face was just inches from mine, separated only by the window. The features were almost human, but distorted. A broad, flat nose, thin lips pulled back to reveal yellowish teeth, and deep-set eyes that glowed a strange greenish blue. Intelligence burned in those eyes, an awareness that was unmistakably conscious. The stench hit me then, even through the closed window. It was overpowering, like rotting meat, wet dog, and something else, something musky and alien. I gagged, covering my mouth with my hand. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Its breathing fogged the glass in rhythmic pulses. I noticed its chest expanding and contracting, the matted fur moving with each breath. There was no expression I could read on that face. It wasn't angry or curious or anything human. It was just watching. After several minutes, it straightened up and returned to the truck bed. It grabbed a jar of dill pickles my mom had insisted I take, along with some other food items, and then, without warning, it turned and sprinted into the forest. I couldn't believe the speed. For something so massive, it moved like an Olympic sprinter, covering ground in huge strides that ate up the distance. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the thick tree line, the only evidence of its presence, the destruction left behind. I sat there, shaking, for a long time. My head wound had dried, crusting blood on my face. The sun had shifted position, shadows lengthening across the forest floor. Eventually I tried the engine. Dead. The crash had killed it. My phone was useless out here. No signal, just as I'd been warned when planning this trip. I needed to get back to the highway. Carefully I pushed open the door, which creaked in protest. I half expected the creature to come charging back at the sound, but the forest remained still. Climbing out, I assessed the damage. One tire completely shredded, front fender crumpled against a pine tree, and my belongings scattered in a 30-foot radius around the truck. I gathered what I could salvage, stuffing it into my torn backpack. The pickle jar was gone, along with most of my food. My tent had survived, though one pole was bent. The sleeping bag was nowhere to be found. The climb back to the highway was steep, and I slipped twice on loose dirt. By the time I reached the road, the sun was starting to set. I stood on the shoulder, thumb out, hoping someone would stop. 3 cars passed before an old Ford Bronco finally pulled over. The driver, a leathery-faced man in his 60s with a John Deere cap, rolled down his window. "You look like hell, son," he said, eyeing my blood-crusted face. "Blew a tire?" "Truck's in the ditch back there," I explained, not mentioning the Sasquatch. Even in my shaken state, I knew how that would sound. "Hop in. There's a gas station about 10 miles up. You can call for a tow from there." The gas station was a run-down place called Jeb's Fill and Go. The attendant, a teenage girl with braces and a bored expression, Let me use the phone. I called home, and Dad answered on the third ring. Ryan, where are you? You should have been at the campground by now. Had an accident, I said, voice steadier than I felt. Blew a tire, went into a ditch. Truck's pretty banged up. Jesus Christ, are you hurt? Cut my head, but I'm okay. I'm at a gas station. Jeb's fill and go. I know it. About 2 hours from here. Sit tight, I'm coming. I hung up and bought a Coke from the vending machine. My hand still trembled as I popped the tab. The girl behind the counter watched me curiously. What happened to you? She asked. I touched my forehead. Car accident. No, I mean, you look scared shitless. I hesitated. Just shaken up from the crash. She shrugged and went back to her magazine. I sat on a plastic chair near the window, watching the darkening forest across the highway. Was it still out there? Watching? Those greenish-blue eyes haunted me, the intelligence behind them. It wasn't an animal, not completely. It had examined me, studied me. Dad arrived with a tow truck he'd arranged from a local service. He hugged me tight, then held me at arm's length to examine my head wound. Should have had that looked at, he scolded. Might need stitches. It's fine. Stopped bleeding hours ago. We followed the tow truck back to my pickup. The driver whistled when he saw the damage. Damn, kid. You're lucky to be walking away from this. As they worked to winch the truck up, Dad looked around at the scattered gear I hadn't been able to retrieve. What happened here? Looks like a tornado hit your stuff. I swallowed hard. Dad, you won't believe what I saw. Try me. So I told him everything. The creature, the attack on the truck, the face at the window, those eyes. As I spoke, Dad's expression changed from concern to skepticism to something like pity. Ryan, he said when I finished, you hit your head pretty hard. Concussions can cause hallucinations. It wasn't a hallucination, I insisted. Look at my gear. You think I did that? He sighed. Animals got into it after the crash. Bears, maybe. They smelled the food. Bears don't have hands. They can't pick things up like it did. The tow truck driver glanced over, a smirk on his face. Dad gave me a look that said, not now. On the drive home, I tried again. Dad, I know what I saw. You know what you think you saw, he corrected. These woods have Bigfoot stories going back 100 years. You've heard them all your life. Your brain was injured, and it filled in the blanks with something familiar. It wasn't like that. He patted my knee. Get some rest. You'll see things differently in the morning. But I didn't. The next day, or the day after, or any day since. I know what I saw on July 17th, 1998. Those eyes, that intelligence. It wasn't human, but it wasn't just an animal either. Dad never believed me. Mom thought I was trying to distract from the fact I'd wrecked the truck. Friends laughed it off as a good campfire story. I stopped talking about it eventually, but I never stopped thinking about it. 3 years later, I was back in those same woods, working a summer job with the Forest Service. I'd given up on college after 2 semesters, couldn't focus, couldn't settle. The wilderness called to me. I needed answers. It was a Tuesday evening in August. I was doing a routine patrol, checking for illegal campsites or fire hazards. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I'd parked my Forest Service truck at a trailhead and was walking the perimeter when I smelled it, that unmistakable stench of wet fur and musk. The hairs on my neck stood up. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. There, between 2 massive Douglas firs, I saw movement. A flash of reddish-brown fur, those eyes catching the last light of day. It was watching me, again. This time, I didn't run. I stood my ground, heart hammering but feet planted firmly on the dirt path. We stared at each other across 50 yards of forest. Neither of us moved. Then, deliberately, it raised one massive hand and placed something on the ground between us. It straightened up, looked at me one more time, and retreated into the shadows. When I was sure it was gone, I approached cautiously. There, sitting in the dirt, was an empty jar, my jar, the pickle jar it had taken 3 years earlier. That was the second encounter, but not the last. Over the years, I've seen it 5 more times. Always at a distance, always watching. Sometimes it leaves things. Once a broken camera that I later discovered belonged to a hiker who'd gone missing in 1987. Another time, a child's teddy bear, decades old but carefully preserved. I've spent 25 years in these forests now. I know every trail, every stream, every ridge. The locals call me Crazy Ryan behind my back. The guy obsessed with Bigfoot. The guy who never left, never married, never moved on. But they don't know what I know. They haven't seen those eyes, haven't felt that intelligence studying them, measuring them, haven't realized that we're not alone in these woods, that something walks alongside humanity, parallel but separate, watching and learning. Dad died in 2015, still convinced I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Mom moved to Arizona, glad to be away from the constant rain and the son who couldn't let go of a childhood fantasy. But I know the truth. And sometimes on still nights when the moon is bright, I sit on my cabin porch with a jar of dill pickles open beside me, an offering, an acknowledgement, and sometimes they're gone by morning. Story 11. I nearly died on the Pinecrest Trail last summer. That's not exaggeration or drama. Whatever followed me through those woods was real, and it was hunting me. My name's Michael Collins. I'm 32, work as an accountant in Oak Ridge County, and spend most weekends hiking and photographing wildlife. Nothing special about me, except I'm still alive after what happened behind the old Whitaker mansion. The day started perfectly. Clear blue skies, temperature in the low 70s. I'd visited the mansion museum twice before, but never explored the nature trail that winds through the property's back acreage. The trail office listed it as moderate difficulty, about 4 miles round trip with some decent elevation changes. Perfect for an afternoon hike. I packed light. My Canon DSLR with 2 lenses, half a liter of water, trail mix, and a light jacket. The trailhead started at the far corner of the parking lot, marked by a wooden sign with a faded map. A young couple was leaving as I arrived. "Nice day for it," the man said, nodding at my camera. "Anything worth shooting out there?" I asked. "Some cool old trees," he said. "Didn't see much wildlife, though." I checked my phone, full battery, decent signal, and hit the trail at 1:17 p.m. The first mile was pleasant. The trail curved gently through mixed hardwoods with occasional clearings that offered views of the rolling countryside. I stopped a few times to photograph interesting tree formations, a cluster of red-capped mushrooms, and a cardinal that watched me from a low branch. Around the halfway point, the trail narrowed and the terrain grew rougher. The trees closed in overhead, creating a green tunnel effect. The temperature dropped a few degrees in the shade. I slowed down, carefully watching my footing on the root-crossed path. That's when I spotted the tree stump about 10 yards off the trail. It was massive, at least 4 feet across, and stood about 6 feet tall where it had been broken or cut. The jagged top created an interesting silhouette against the forest backdrop, perfect for a composition shot. I stepped carefully off the trail, making my way to the stump. The forest floor was soft, with decades of fallen leaves. I circled the stump, taking shots from different angles, adjusting my aperture to capture the texture of the weathered wood against the background foliage. I had just switched to my zoom lens when I heard it. Swish, 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 fast and rhythmic, like someone violently shaking small trees or branches. The sound came from deeper in the woods, maybe 50 feet beyond where I stood. Before I could process what I was hearing, a heavy thump followed, as if something substantial had stomped or landed on the ground. I froze, finger hovering over the shutter button. The woods fell silent again. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded thin and artificial against the dense foliage. Silence answered me. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a black bear, though they weren't common in this part of the state. I packed my zoom lens away, suddenly eager to get back to the marked trail. I had just stepped back onto the path when the sound came again. Swish, 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 followed by that heavy thump. Louder this time, closer. My heart rate spiked. I scanned the woods in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing through the thick undergrowth. No movement, no silhouette, no indication of what was making that unnatural sound. "Is someone there?" I called again, my voice cracking slightly. I waited 30 seconds, a minute. The forest remained still except for the gentle movement of leaves in the light breeze. I started walking again, faster now, glancing back over my shoulder every few steps. The path sloped downward, requiring my attention to avoid tripping on exposed roots and rocks. I fumbled with my camera bag, securing it closed as I moved. That's when it happened a third time. Swish, 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 thump. The volume made me jump. Whatever was making that sound was definitely following me, definitely getting closer. The swishing was more violent, the impact heavier. It resonated through the ground under my feet. I broke into a jog, no longer concerned about photography or enjoying the scenery. My camera bag bounced awkwardly against my hip as I navigated the uneven trail. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool shade. The trail curved sharply around a large boulder, then descended into a small ravine with a wooden footbridge crossing a dry creek bed. I was halfway across the bridge when I heard it again, but this time it was different. The swishing sound was faster, more aggressive, and the thump that followed shook the bridge beneath me. I looked back and saw the trees at the top of the ravine shaking violently. I ran. Not a careful jog anymore, but a full panic sprint. The trail climbed steeply on the other side of the ravine, and my lungs burned as I pushed uphill. My feet slipped on loose gravel, and I caught myself with my hands, scraping my palm on a rock. I scrambled back up, driven by pure fear. I'd covered maybe 500 yards when I heard an enormous impact behind me. Thump! So powerful I felt it through my feet. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder and saw nothing but trembling vegetation about 80 feet back. Whatever was following me had closed half the distance in seconds. "Help!" I shouted, though I knew no one could hear me this deep in the woods. "Somebody help!" I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. My camera bounced painfully against my ribs. My breathing came in ragged gasps. I focused entirely on the trail ahead, terrified of what I might see if I looked back again. After a few minutes of dead sprint, I lost the trail. The path had curved, but in my panic, I'd continued straight, charging through underbrush and between trees. I stopped, spinning in place, trying to find the trail markers. The swishing sound came again, followed by the ground-shaking impact. Closer still, I spotted a flash of blue, a trail marker, about 30 yards to my right, and crashed through the vegetation toward it. Branches whipped my face. I tripped on an exposed root and fell hard, landing on my camera with a sickening crack. The pain in my chest told me I'd bruised or maybe broken a rib, but adrenaline kept me moving. Back on the trail I ran with reckless abandon. The swishing thumping continued behind me, seemingly matching my pace. Sometimes it would fade slightly, then suddenly sound much closer, as if the thing were toying with me. The next few minutes blurred together. I remember the metallic taste of blood in my mouth from biting my tongue when I fell, the burning in my lungs, the certainty that I wouldn't make it out alive. The trail widened slightly, and I recognized a fallen log I'd photographed earlier. I was heading back toward the mansion. Hope gave me a second wind, and I pushed myself harder despite the stabbing pain in my side. The sounds behind me grew more distant. The thumping became less frequent. As the trees thinned and I caught glimpses of the mansion's roof through the canopy, the noises stopped altogether. I burst from the tree line into the manicured back lawn of the Whitaker mansion, startling an elderly couple taking photos of the building. I doubled over, hands on my knees, sucking air into my burning lungs. "Young man, are you all right?" the woman asked, taking a hesitant step toward me. I couldn't answer immediately. My legs trembled, sweat dripped from my face onto the grass. I straightened up and looked back at the forest edge. Nothing moved there. The woods looked peaceful, ordinary. "Did you see anything? Hear anything?" I finally managed to ask them, my voice hoarse. They exchanged concerned glances. "Just you, running out of those woods like the devil himself was chasing you," the man said. I spent the next 30 minutes sitting on a bench near the mansion's back porch, drinking water provided by concerned museum staff. I told them I'd gotten spooked by what I thought was a bear, though I knew that was a lie. Bears don't move that fast. Bears don't make that swishing sound before they stomp the ground. Bears don't deliberately stalk humans for over a mile through dense forest. I drove home with my windows up and doors locked, checking my rearview mirror compulsively. My camera was damaged beyond repair, the lens shattered and body cracked. I didn't care. I was alive. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about that swishing sound. In my dreams, I would finally turn around and see what was chasing me. But I always woke up before its face came into focus. I researched local wildlife, looking for anything that might explain what I experienced. Nothing fit. I avoided hiking altogether for 2 months. When I finally worked up the courage to hit the trails again, I stuck to wide, popular paths near the city. I bought a new camera, but felt no joy in using it. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every rustle in the undergrowth sent my heart racing. It took almost a year before I could bring myself to return to Whitaker Mansion. I told myself I needed closure. I needed to prove to myself that there was nothing supernatural in those woods, that I had simply worked myself into a panic over normal forest sounds. I arrived early on a Saturday morning. The parking lot was empty except for a staff member's car. I sat in my vehicle for 20 minutes, gathering my courage before finally stepping out into the cool morning air. The trailhead looked exactly the same, the faded wooden sign, the narrow path disappearing into the trees. I had a new camera around my neck, bear spray on my belt, and a walking stick in my hand. I made it about a quarter-mile in before stopping. The forest was quiet except for birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Everything looked normal. I took a few photos of wildflowers growing alongside the path, trying to recapture the joy I once felt in nature photography. That's when I heard it. Distant but unmistakable. Swish, swish, swish. Thump. I didn't call out this time. I didn't run immediately. I stood perfectly still, listening. It came again, farther along the trail, waiting for me. I turned around and walked steadily back to the parking lot. Not running, not panicking, but moving with purpose. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away from Whitaker Mansion. I haven't been back since. I still hike other trails, still take photos, but never alone. And I never walk the full length of any path through the woods. Whatever was in the forest that day is still there, and I know now that there are some things in this world we aren't meant to understand or see. I just count myself lucky that it apparently doesn't like to venture too close to civilization. If it had followed me all the way to the mansion that day, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Sometimes at night, when the wind shakes the trees outside my bedroom window, I hear it again in my mind. That unnatural rhythm, that heavy impact. Swish, swish, swish. Thump. And I know it's still out there, waiting. It did. Story 12. The first rock hit my tent at 2:17 a.m. I remember checking my watch, the luminous dial glowing in the darkness. I'd been restless anyway, caught in that limbo between sleep and wakefulness that comes with camping at altitude. The sound was distinct, not the gentle patter of rain or the rustle of wind, but the deliberate impact of stone against nylon. My name is Logan Peterson, and I'd been hiking the Crescent Ridge Trail in the Rockies for 3 days. Not just any hike. This was personal. I carried more than just supplies in my pack. I carried history. My great-great-grandfather Jackson Townsend had traversed these same mountains in 1887, documenting his journey in a leather-bound journal that had been passed down through generations until it reached me. Another rock struck the tent, larger this time. The fabric shuddered. I sat up, my sleeping bag falling to my waist as I fumbled for my headlamp. The temperature inside the tent hovered around 40 degrees, and my breath formed small clouds in the beam of light. Something was out there. Bear? Mountain lion? The possibilities raced through my mind as I pulled on my boots. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The moon hung full and bright in the clear mountain sky, casting stark shadows across my small campsite. The fire I'd built earlier was now just glowing embers. My food bag hung properly from a tree branch 20 yards away. Movement caught my eye, not at ground level, but higher up on the boulder field that rose behind my tent. Something large shifted between two massive rocks. I opened the tent zipper wider, my hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray clipped to my belt. That's when I saw it. Standing atop the highest boulder, silhouetted against the night sky, was a figure unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Even at this distance, I could tell it was massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It stood upright on 2 legs, its broad shoulders and large head unmistakably humanoid, yet clearly not human. My mind flashed to a passage from Jackson's journal, the words I'd read hundreds of times since childhood. May 17th, 1887. Today, I discovered footprints of a gigantic being near Crescent Ridge. The impressions measured nearly 17 inches in length, with 5 distinct toe marks. I followed them for a mile before losing the trail at the snowline. The locals speak of a creature that walks these mountains, ancient as the rocks themselves. I dismiss such tales as frontier superstition, and yet these tracks defy explanation. The creature moved, not away but toward me, descending the boulder field with surprising grace for something so large. Each deliberate step brought it closer, my muscles locked in place. Running seemed both necessary and impossible. As it approached, details emerged in the moonlight. Long, powerful arms swung at its sides. Thick, dark fur covered its body. Its chest was broad and deep. But it was the face that held me transfixed, a blend of ape and human features with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, flat nose. 10 yards away now, it slowed its approach. 7 yards, 5. It stopped just 2 long strides from where I stood, half in and half out of my tent, paralyzed with fear. The creature lowered itself into a crouch, bending its long legs and resting massive hands on the ground. In this position, its eyes became level with mine. Those eyes, dark and reflective in the moonlight, studied me with unmistakable intelligence. We stared at each other, 2 beings separated by millennia of evolution, yet sharing this moment in time. My heart pounded so hard, I felt it might crack my ribs. Sweat formed on my forehead, despite the cold night air. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The creature's nostrils flared as it sniffed the air between us. Something about my scent seemed to displease it. Its head shook slightly, a brief sideways motion that was eerily human in its expressiveness. For what felt like hours, but must have been only minutes, we remained locked in this strange communion. I noticed our breathing had synchronized, both of us taking slow, careful inhalations, as if neither wanted to disturb the fragile moment. Then, with no warning, the creature straightened to its full height. It towered over me, moonlight outlining its massive form. It gave me one final look, not threatening, not friendly, just aware, before turning and moving away with long, powerful strides. It didn't look back as it disappeared into the tree line at the edge of the clearing. I collapsed back into my tent, my legs finally giving out. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake until the first grey light of dawn filtered through the nylon walls. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up camp. My hands shook as I rolled my sleeping bag and collapsed the tent poles. The events of the night felt dreamlike in the early morning light, but I knew what I'd seen. By 7:30 a.m., I was on the trail again, pushing higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner, the temperature dropped, and patches of snow appeared beside the trail. My plan had been to follow Jackson's route as closely as possible, which meant ascending to Crystal Pass before descending into the valley beyond. The trail steepened as I climbed, switching back and forth across the face of the mountain. My calves burned with the effort. The trek gave me time to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to turn back, to get off this mountain and never return. But a stronger impulse drove me forward. I needed confirmation. I needed to know if what I'd seen was the same creature my ancestor had tracked over a century ago. At 9,800 feet, the trail disappeared under a blanket of snow. I paused to catch my breath, leaning on my trekking poles and surveying the white expanse ahead. That's when I saw them, a line of depressions in the snow leading toward the pass. Not the round prints of a bear or the oval tracks of an elk. These were elongated, with distinct toe impressions visible even from where I stood. My heart rate spiked again. I moved closer, kneeling beside the nearest print. It was huge, easily 16 inches from heel to toe. 5 toes, just as Jackson had described. The stride length between prints measured nearly 5 feet, an impossible distance for a human. I pulled off my backpack and removed Jackson's journal from its waterproof case. The leather cover was cracked and faded with age. I turned to the dog-eared page where he'd sketched the tracks he'd found. The resemblance was undeniable. Same shape, same size, same 5-toed pattern. These were fresh tracks made within the last few hours. The creature, my creature, had passed this way after our encounter. I realized with a jolt that it was heading toward Crystal Pass, the same destination I'd planned for today. A rational voice in my head screamed at me to turn around. Whatever this thing was, following it seemed like madness, but I'd come too far to turn back now. Jackson had lost the trail at the snow line. I had the advantage of fresh tracks. I replaced the journal in my pack and hoisted it onto my shoulders. The snow crunched under my boots as I followed the tracks upward. The climb grew more difficult as the snow deepened. By noon, I was post-holing up to my knees with each step. The sun reflected blindingly off the white surface, forcing me to don my sunglasses despite the chill. I checked my GPS. 10,400 feet. Crystal Pass lay at 11,200, less than a mile ahead. The tracks continued, unwavering in their straight line toward the pass. Whatever made them hadn't struggled through the snow as I was. The impressions were clean, as if the creature's weight had compressed the snow without sinking deeply into it. At 1:30 p.m., I stopped for a quick lunch. Cold jerky and trail mix, washed down with water I had to keep inside my jacket to prevent it from freezing. The temperature had dropped to the low 20s, and clouds were building to the west. The weather report had mentioned a possible storm system moving in by evening. I needed to reach the pass and start my descent before that happened. I resumed following the tracks. The terrain steepened dramatically for the final approach to the pass. My breathing became labored in the thin air, and I had to stop every 50 yards to rest. But the tracks spurred me onward. They were leading me exactly where Jackson had gone, connecting me to my family's past in a way I'd never anticipated. At 3:17 p.m., I reached Crystal Pass. The narrow gap between 2 rocky peaks opened to reveal a breathtaking view of the valley beyond. Steep slopes fell away on both sides of the pass, creating a natural bottleneck. Wind howled through the gap, whipping snow into miniature tornadoes. The tracks led straight through the pass and continued down the other side. I paused at the highest point, surveying the route ahead. The western slope appeared steeper than the eastern side I'd just climbed, dropping nearly 2,000 feet to a tree-lined valley below. The storm clouds I'd spotted earlier were closer now, dark and threatening. I estimated I had 2 hours at most before they arrived, enough time to descend to the tree line where I could make camp with some protection from the weather. I began my descent, following the creature's tracks down the western slope. The snow here was deeper, making progress slow and treacherous. Twice I lost my footing and slid several yards before managing to self-arrest with my trekking poles. At 4:30 p.m., I reached the first stands of stunted pines that marked the beginning of the tree line. The tracks continued straight through the trees, never deviating around obstacles as a human would. Whatever made these simply stepped over fallen logs and pushed through dense undergrowth. The first fat snowflakes began to fall as I searched for a suitable campsite. I found a relatively flat spot beneath a cluster of mature pines that would offer some shelter from the storm. Working quickly, I stamped down the snow and set up my tent. By the time I had secured the rainfly, the snowfall had intensified. Inside the tent, I changed into dry base layers and fired up my small camp stove to melt snow for water. The wind picked up, shaking the tent walls as darkness fell. I checked my GPS one last time before the batteries died. I was at 100 feet, about 5 miles from the nearest marked trail. Not exactly lost, but definitely in a remote section of the range. As I huddled in my sleeping bag, sipping hot tea from my insulated mug, my thoughts returned to the creature. What was it? The locals around these parts had stories, of course. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the mountain walker. Every rural region in America has its monster myths, but I'd seen it with my own eyes. I'd followed its tracks across the mountain. This was no myth. The storm intensified throughout the night. Snow accumulated on the tent, forcing me to push up on the fabric periodically to prevent collapse. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the howling wind and the creaking of tree branches under the weight of fresh snow. Morning brought an eerie silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind nearly 2 feet of fresh powder. I unzipped the tent door to find a world transformed, every surface blanketed in pristine white. The tracks were gone, buried beneath the new snow. My connection to the creature, my link to Jackson's journey, had vanished overnight. I felt a surprising pang of loss. I made a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal before breaking camp. The hike out would be challenging in these conditions. The nearest ranger station was at Miller's Creek, about 12 miles northwest, according to my map. With the deep snow, that meant at least 7 hours of hiking. I packed methodically, strapping my snowshoes to my boots for the first time this trip. As I shouldered my pack and prepared to leave, a sound stopped me cold. The distinct crack of a branch breaking under weight. Not the normal settling of snow-laden trees, but something deliberate. I turned slowly toward the source of the sound. Through the trees, perhaps 50 yards away, stood the creature. In daylight, its features were clearer. The fur was not black as I'd thought in the moonlight, but a deep, reddish brown. Its face was more expressive than I'd realized, with a prominent brow and deep-set eyes that watched me intently. We stared at each other across the snow-covered distance, neither moving. Then, deliberately, it raised one massive hand and pressed it against its chest. The gesture was unmistakably communicative, though its meaning escaped me. Before I could react, it turned and moved away through the trees, its long strides carrying it quickly out of sight. I stood frozen for several minutes, processing what had just happened. That gesture, it had been trying to tell me something. I started hiking toward Miller's Creek, my snowshoes squeaking against the fresh powder. The sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling display of white. As I walked, I pulled Jackson's journal from my pack one more time and flipped to the final entry from his Rocky Mountain expedition, May 20th, 1887. I depart these mountains with more questions than answers. The tracks ended at the snow line, as if their maker simply vanished into the thin mountain air. I cannot explain what I saw, nor can I dismiss it as mere fancy. Perhaps some secrets belong to the mountains alone. I leave them here, where they have remained for countless ages before my arrival, and where they shall remain long after I am dust. I closed the journal and continued walking. Jackson never returned to these mountains. but his experience had been passed down through generations until it reached me. And now I had my own story to tell, of massive footprints in the snow, of a nighttime encounter by moonlight, and of a creature that had acknowledged me with a gesture I still didn't understand. The mountains kept their secrets close, revealing them only in glimpses to those who ventured into their most remote corners. My ancestor and I had been granted such glimpses, separated by more than a century, but connected by the same mysterious presence that roamed these peaks. As I hiked towards civilization, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would return to these mountains. The creature was still out there, walking the same remote ridges its kind had traversed for generations untold. And somehow, for reasons I couldn't explain, it had recognized me. Not as a threat, but as something familiar. As if perhaps it remembered my bloodline from an encounter long ago with a man named Jackson Townsend, who had followed its tracks until they disappeared at the snow line. Like my ancestor before me, I left the mountains with more questions than answers. But unlike him, I would be back. The watcher in the mountains would see me again. Story 13. And the first blow to my windshield happened so fast I didn't know what was happening. 1 second I was driving up the gravel road to my cabin. The next there was an explosion of glass, and the Jeep swerved hard right. My headlights caught a blur of movement from the steep bank above the road. A goddamn log was sticking through my windshield. My name's Woody Hawkins. I'm 54 years old, born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida, but these North Carolina mountains have been my second home for nearly 2 decades. December 2015 was supposed to be like any other hunting season at my Iron Mountain cabin. My son Danny had just left after we'd had words about his drinking. I had 4 deer to process, and bear season was coming. I was looking forward to the quiet. I'd driven down to the general store in Burnsville for supplies. Coffee, bacon, shells for my 444 Marlin. It was pitch black by the time I headed back up the mountain. No moon, just my headlights cutting through the darkness of Piscan National Forest. I was about 300 yards from my cabin when it happened. The log came from a laurel thicket on the steep slope above the driver's side. It smashed through the windshield and embedded itself in the passenger seat, 5 feet long and thick as a coffee can. Had I not leaned forward to adjust the heater, my face would have been where that log hit. My training kicked in before my brain caught up. 23 years working hurricane response in Florida teaches you to react, not freeze. I threw the Jeep in park, grabbed my 9mm Glock from the center console, and rolled out the driver's door. I fired 18 rounds into that laurel thicket, not aiming, just creating cover fire while I backed down the road. My hands were steady, but my breath came in short bursts. The cold December air burned my lungs. All I could hear was the ringing in my ears from the gunshots and the ticking of my Jeep's engine. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before reality set in. No human could have thrown that log. Not like that, not with that force, not with that accuracy in the dark. I'd been hunting these mountains for years. I knew what bears could do. This wasn't a bear. The Jeep was still running, headlights illuminating a cloud of dust and gunpowder. Blood trickled down my forearm from a cut caused by flying glass. I reached back into the vehicle and grabbed my 444 Marlin Bear rifle. The weight of it steadied me. I had 3 options: investigate the thicket, drive back to town, or get to my cabin. The cabin was closest, and it had reinforced doors, windows, and my shotgun. I drove the final stretch with one hand on the wheel, one on the rifle, hunched below the shattered windshield. Gravel crunched under the tires. The forest seemed to close in around my headlights. At the cabin, I backed the Jeep up against the porch steps, killed the engine, and made a dash for the door. I fumbled with the keys, the rifle awkward in my grip. Inside, I locked the deadbolt, checked all the windows, and loaded my Remington 870 shotgun. Then I sat with my back against the wall, facing the door. Nothing happened that night. Nothing I could see, at least. But I heard things. Heavy footsteps on the gravel driveway around 2 a.m. Slow, deliberate. Not a deer or a bear. Too heavy, too regular. Then silence for an hour. At 3:27 a.m., I remember looking at my watch. Something hit the north wall of the cabin, not like a branch falling, like something pushed against it. A solid thud. Then another. I chambered around in the shotgun. The thuds stopped. As dawn broke, I saw nothing outside but my damaged jeep and the familiar outline of the forest. The morning light revealed what the log had done. It had punched through tempered safety glass, then embedded itself 6 inches into the passenger seat. The force required was enormous. I spent that day processing 2 of the deer carcasses I had hanging in the shed. I worked quickly, the rifle slung across my back the entire time. I'd faced down Category 5 hurricanes, floodwaters and looters, but nothing had ever unnerved me like this. This was calculated. This was targeted. The second night was worse. The footsteps started earlier, circling the cabin, not trying to hide. Something dragged across the wooden porch. The generator shed door slammed repeatedly, though there was no wind. Around midnight, I heard a sound I still can't describe properly, like a cross between a whale call and the screech of metal scraping metal. It came from just beyond the tree line, maybe 50 yards out. I maintained my position inside, alternating between the shotgun and the rifle. Sleep wasn't an option. I boiled coffee on the propane stove and kept the lantern on low. By the third morning, I'd had enough. I packed my gear, loaded the processed venison into coolers, and prepared to leave. The Jeep needed plastic sheeting over the windshield, which meant going outside for the first time since the attack. I stepped onto the porch with the 444 in hand, scanning the surroundings. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no squirrels. I worked quickly, securing plastic over the windshield frame with duct tape. That's when I noticed the log was gone from the passenger seat. I hadn't removed it. It was just gone. I left the cabin by noon. The drive down the mountain was tense but uneventful. I told the sheriff in Burnsville about the vandalism, suggesting kids or meth heads might be responsible. He promised to send a deputy up to check things out. I didn't mention the footsteps or the sounds, didn't mention that no human could have thrown that log. I returned to Florida, but the mountains called me back the following fall. I brought Danny and his cousin Travis with me. Safety in numbers. I didn't tell them about the previous year, just said the Jeep had hit a fallen tree. The first 3 days were normal. Hunting was good. We bagged 2 bucks. On the 4th night, while Danny and Travis were in town at the bar, I heard the footsteps again. This time they came right up to the porch. Something heavy moved across the wooden planks. The floorboards creaked under significant weight. I kept my rifle trained on the door. The handle turned slowly, deliberately. But the deadbolt held. Whatever was out there knew how doors worked. It tried the windows next, testing each one methodically. When Danny and Travis returned an hour later, the presence had vanished. They noticed nothing unusual except my tension. The next morning, I discovered the copper gas line had been pulled from the propane tank regulator. Not cut, pulled. The flare at the end had been straightened without damaging the threading or the regulator itself. Anyone who's worked with copper gas lines knows that's nearly impossible. It requires precise force applied in exactly the right way. We repaired it and finished our trip without incident, but I knew we weren't alone on that mountain. By 2017, I'd upgraded the cabin's security. Motion-activated floodlights covered the perimeter. I'd replaced the Jeep with a modified Ford Excursion equipped with 50,000 lumens of auxiliary lighting, enough to turn night into day at the flip of a switch. That October, I was alone again. I'd set up a deer bait pile about 60 yards from the cabin, visible from the kitchen window. Around dusk on my second day, movement caught my eye. Something was watching the bait pile from behind a large oak tree, not a deer, much bigger. I grabbed my binoculars. What I saw still haunts me. A pair of glowing white eyes, about 8 inches apart, peering around the tree trunk. They'd appear, then duck back, then appear again on the other side, like it was playing peekaboo, taunting me. I switched on the floodlights. The eyes vanished. Nothing moved in the forest for hours afterward. The following spring, I brought my dog, Cooper, a 100-pound chocolate lab. He loved the mountains, splashing in the creek and chasing squirrels. 3 days into our stay, Cooper and I walked down to the creek around sunset. He ran ahead, disappearing around a bend in the trail. The yelp I heard wasn't pain. It was pure terror. Cooper came tearing back up the trail, running so hard his paws barely touched the ground. He pushed past me, sprinting all the way back to the cabin. I found him under my bed, trembling. His collar was missing, not broken, missing, as if someone had removed it. Cooper refused to go near the creek after that. If I tried to lead him that way, he'd plant his feet and whine. At night, he'd growl at the darkness beyond the windows. We left the next day. I didn't return until fall, this time with my brother Rick. I told him everything. He didn't believe me at first, but agreed to bring his AR-15 along with his hunting gear. "If something's out there, we'll find it," he said. We were sitting on the porch our second evening, drinking beer, when a rock landed between our chairs. It was the size of a baseball, perfectly round, too round to be natural, almost polished. It hadn't fallen from above. It had been thrown from the darkness, beyond the floodlights. Rick saw the second one coming. "Down!" he shouted, pulling me sideways as another rock whizzed through the space where my head had been. It hit the cabin wall hard enough to dent the wood siding. We grabbed our rifles and switched on every light we had. The forest lit up like a stadium. Nothing moved. "Jesus Christ," Rick whispered. "What the hell was that?" "That's George," I said. The name had come to me suddenly. Giving it a name made it less terrifying somehow. He's been here a while. Over the next 3 years, I maintained an uneasy truce with whatever roamed Iron Mountain. I never went to the cabin alone again. I installed more lights, a better generator, reinforced the doors and windows. I started leaving offerings, usually a deer haunch or some fish, at the edge of the clearing. Sometimes they'd be gone by morning. Sometimes they'd be rearranged, stacked in unnatural formations. The incidents became less aggressive, but more bizarre. In 2019, every single tree along the driveway had 3 parallel marks carved into the bark, all at the same height, about 7 feet up. In 2020, we found every trail camera we'd set up neatly disassembled, the components arranged in perfect rows on the hood of Rick's truck, batteries separated from casings, memory cards placed beside lenses, not damaged, disassembled. Last October, Danny's son, my grandson Tyler, spotted something while we were grilling on the deck. "Grandpa," he said, pointing to the tree line, "there's a big man watching us." I looked where he was pointing. For just a second I saw it clearly. Tall, at least 8 feet, broad shoulders, arms too long for its body. Not a man, not a bear. Then it was gone, melting into the forest without disturbing a single branch. Tyler wasn't scared. Kids rarely are. "Is that your friend, Grandpa?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. "I've come to an understanding with whatever shares my mountain. I won't hunt it if it keeps its distance. I leave offerings now and then. I've stopped trying to photograph it or catch it on camera. In return, it hasn't tried to hurt any of us since that first night with the log. But I still keep the 444 loaded. I still keep the floodlights ready, and I never, ever go into those woods alone after dark. Some nights, when the others are asleep, I sit on the porch and listen to the forest. Sometimes I hear it moving through the trees. Sometimes I feel it watching, not with malice anymore, with curiosity maybe. This past summer, I found something on the porch steps one morning. My old license plate from the Jeep, the one that was destroyed that night in 2015. It had been missing for years. There it was, bent into the shape of a crude boat. George was returning my property. Or maybe he was telling me a story I couldn't understand. The mountains of North Carolina have always held secrets, caves that go deeper than any survey has mapped, forests older than the nation itself. People have disappeared in these hills for centuries. I've got 10, maybe 15 good years left in me. I'll keep coming back to Iron Mountain. I'll keep processing my deer with a rifle on my shoulder. I'll keep the lights on and the doors locked. And somewhere in those dark woods, George will be watching. Waiting. For what? I don't know. But we've got an understanding now, George and me. This mountain's big enough for both of us, as long as we respect each other's boundaries. At least that's what I tell myself when I hear those heavy footsteps in the night. Lady de Kitchen, Story 14. Yes, sir. I knew I'd screwed up the minute I heard that growl. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a wolf, nothing I could place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name's Kevin. I'm 23, living in Calgary, working a mind-numbing office job that had been slowly killing my soul. By mid-July, I needed to escape. I needed trees, open sky, and silence. Real silence. Not the artificial quiet of my apartment with the hum of the refrigerator and the neighbors arguing through the walls. I packed my truck on Thursday night. Tent, sleeping bag, cooler of food, camping stove, and enough water to last 4 days. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not my roommate, not my parents, not even my buddy Trent, who I usually went camping with. This trip was for me alone. I'd heard about Ram River Falls from a guy at work. Most beautiful spot in Alberta, he'd said. Just don't tell the rangers you're spending the night. When I asked why, he just winked and said the camping areas were restricted, but the view was worth the risk. The drive took about 3 hours from Calgary. The last 45 minutes on a dirt road so rough, I worried about my truck's suspension. I parked at the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon on Friday and hiked in with my gear. It wasn't an easy trek. Nearly 4 miles of steep, rocky terrain with a full pack. Sweat soaked through my shirt before I'd gone half a mile. When I reached the falls, I stopped dead in my tracks. The water thundered down a 100-foot drop, crashing into a crystal-clear pool below. Mist hung in the air, catching the sunlight and creating rainbows. Pine trees stood like sentinels around the clearing. It was perfect. I set up camp about 200 yards from the falls, in a flat spot partially hidden by a stand of trees. The roar of the water was constant, but somehow soothing. I pitched my tent, arranged my supplies, and built a fire pit with rocks from the riverbed. By evening, I had a small fire going and was cooking beans and hot dogs on my camp stove. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in oranges and purples before darkness crept in. The stars appeared, more than I'd ever seen in the city, a dazzling canopy above me. I felt small beneath them, but in a good way. Insignificant but free. I tossed another log on the fire and settled back in my camp chair, a can of beer in my hand. This was what I needed. Just me, the wilderness, and absolute solitude. Then I heard it. The growl started low, almost below the range of human hearing, but I felt it in my chest before I heard it in my ears. It built slowly, rising in pitch and volume until it filled the clearing. Deep, rumbling, and utterly alien. I jumped to my feet, spilling beer down my pants. My heart hammered against my ribs as I spun around, trying to locate the source. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it at the tree line, sweeping the beam back and forth across the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. The forest had gone silent. No crickets, no nightbirds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the constant rush of the falls and my own ragged breathing. I stood there for at least 10 minutes, flashlight in one hand, my hunting knife in the other, waiting for whatever had made that sound to show itself. Nothing came. Eventually, I sat back down, but I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire burning high and my knife close. Morning came with a pale gray light filtering through the trees. I stepped out of my tent, stiff from sitting upright all night, and froze. There, in the soft dirt around my campsite, were footprints. Massive footprints circling my camp. I placed my boot next to one for comparison. My size 11 hiking boot looked like a child's shoe beside it. The print was at least twice as large, with long, pronounced toes that dug deep into the soil. The stride length was enormous, at least 5 feet between prints. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They circled my fire pit in a complete loop, then led toward the edge of the falls, and finally disappeared back into the forest to the north. Whatever had made those prints had stood at the edge of the waterfall, looking down before returning to the trees. A sensible person would have packed up and left right then. I wasn't sensible. I was curious, and that's always been my problem. Instead of leaving, I spent the day exploring the area, hiking along the river upstream from the falls, taking photos and trying to convince myself that the prints were from some large bear walking in a weird way. By evening, I was back at my camp. I built the fire higher than the previous night and cooked a quick meal of instant noodles. The forest seemed normal during the day. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, the wind rustled through the pines. But as darkness fell, the natural sounds faded again, leaving only the falls. I sat with my back to a large boulder, facing the fire, giving myself a view of as much of the surrounding area as possible. The moon was brighter than the night before, casting silver light through the trees. That's when I saw them. At first, they were just shapes in the darkness. 3 massive silhouettes moving between the trees, about 50 yards from my camp. They were tall, far taller than any human, and they moved with a strange, deliberate gait. They seemed to be circling, keeping their distance but always watching. I fumbled for my flashlight and pointed it toward the nearest shape. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes reflecting the light, like burning flames in the darkness. Then it was gone, moving behind a tree. One of them made a sound, a howl that started like a wolf's, but transformed into something that chilled my blood. It sounded almost human, like someone trying to imitate a wolf call, but with a voice that hadn't spoken in centuries. The howl echoed off the rocks, seemingly coming from everywhere at once. I didn't sleep that night either. The 3 figures kept their distance, but they never left. Whenever I shined my light toward them, they would slip behind trees or rocks, but I could still feel their eyes on me. Yellow, unblinking eyes watching my every move. By the 3rd morning, I was exhausted and jumpy. I considered packing up and leaving, but daylight brought back my courage, or my stupidity. I told myself they were just curious animals, maybe some undocumented species living in this remote region. I decided to stay one more night. I spent the day gathering more firewood, building my fire pit higher and wider. I found a stout branch that I could use as a club if needed. I was scared, but also exhilarated. No one else had seen what I was seeing. I could be making a major discovery. Night fell faster than I expected. I built my fire up as high as I dared, creating a circle of light about 20 feet across. I heated a can of beef stew and ate it quickly, my eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. They returned as soon as full darkness descended, but this time they didn't stay hidden. One of them stepped forward right to the edge of the firelight, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe 9, with broad shoulders and long muscular arms that hung down past its knees. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, tangled with twigs, leaves, and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Its face was the worst part. Not quite human, not quite animal. Sunken yellow eyes glowed in the firelight, set deep in a face with a prominent brow ridge. Its mouth was wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. The smell hit me next, the stench of rotting meat and wet fur, so strong I gagged. The creature tilted its head, studying me with those burning eyes. Behind it, the other 2 prowled at the edge of the light, occasionally making low chirping sounds to each other. The one in front reached down and picked up a rock, a boulder really, the size of a bowling ball, and hurled it toward me with frightening ease. It landed just short of my fire, sending sparks flying into the air. A warning shot. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. These weren't bears walking upright. They weren't any known animal. They moved with purpose, with intelligence. After what seemed like hours, they retreated back into the darkness, but I could still see their eyes watching from just beyond the firelight. I stayed awake all night, feeding the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. The fourth day, I decided to leave. I started packing up my gear as soon as there was enough light to see. But my hands were shaking so badly from exhaustion and fear that I kept dropping things. It took me twice as long as it should have to break down my tent. I left the food. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted out of there. I stuffed my sleeping bag and tent into my backpack and prepared to hike back to my truck. But as I shouldered my pack, I heard movement in the trees. They were still there, watching me even in daylight. I caught glimpses of dark shapes moving parallel to me as I started down the trail. I decided to wait until nightfall had passed. Maybe they'd lose interest. Maybe I could slip away in the morning. It was a mistake. The fourth night was the worst. They didn't wait for full darkness. As the sun was setting, they emerged from the trees with aggression I hadn't seen before. They crashed through the undergrowth, breaking branches, howling that terrible half-human howl. They were angry. I rebuilt my fire as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely strike the match. The largest one, the one that had thrown the rock the night before, stepped directly into my camp. It stood over me, at least 9 feet tall, its breath visible in the cool evening air. With one massive hand, it grabbed my tent and ripped it apart like it was made of paper. Another one started pelting the trees around my camp with rocks, making loud cracking sounds as bark splintered. They were trying to scare me away, and it was working. I felt a warm wetness spreading down my leg and realized I'd pissed myself in terror. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The largest creature leaned down until its face was just feet from mine. Its yellow eyes reflected the firelight, pupils contracting to pinpoints. It opened its mouth and released a breath that smelled like death. Then it spoke. At least, I think it spoke. It made a series of clicks and guttural sounds that had the cadence of language but like nothing I'd ever heard before. It pointed one long, clawed finger at me, then pointed away, down the trail toward my truck. The message was clear. Leave. I nodded frantically, picking up my pack with trembling hands. The creature stepped back, giving me space to move. I didn't run. Somehow I knew running would be a mistake. Instead, I walked slowly backward, keeping my eyes on the 3 massive figures until I reached the trail. I spent that night huddled under a fallen log about a mile down the trail, too terrified to continue in the darkness, but too afraid to stay near my destroyed camp. I didn't sleep. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves convinced me they were coming for me. At the first light of dawn on the 5th day, I ran. I didn't care about making noise or looking brave anymore. I just ran, stumbling down the rocky trail, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. I fell twice, scraping my hands and knees bloody on the rocks, but I got up and kept going. I felt their eyes on me the whole way. Once I looked back and saw a dark shape standing on a ridge above the trail, silhouetted against the morning sky. It raised one long arm, not in threat, but almost in farewell. I reached my truck around 7 in the morning. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. I threw my pack in the back and started the engine, driving away so fast I nearly went off the narrow dirt road on the first curve. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't told anyone the full story until now. Who would believe me? I've researched everything I can find about Ram River Falls. There are scattered reports of strange sightings and unexplained sounds, but nothing like what I experienced. I'm still fascinated by what I saw. Part of me wants to go back with a camera, maybe with friends for safety. But a larger part of me knows that would be suicide. Those creatures, whatever they were letting me go. They could have killed me easily, but they chose to warn me instead. I made a vow as I drove away from Ram River Falls that morning. I'm never going back there. No matter how much I want answers, no matter how much the mystery consumes my thoughts, I'm never returning to those falls. Some places in this world don't belong to us. Some places have watchers that have been there long before humans arrived and will remain long after we're gone. Ram River Falls belongs to them, and they made it very clear they want to keep it that way. Story 15. I never believed in monsters until I saw one with my own eyes. That's not something a man admits lightly, especially not someone like me. Folks around Brevard know me as Jim Hawkins, practical as they come. I run the hardware store in town, coach Little League on weekends, and take my daughter camping once a month like clockwork since her mama passed. No one would call me fanciful. But what happened that night at Davidson River changed everything. September had just started, bringing that first cool breath promising fall. My daughter Abby had been begging to go camping before school got too busy. She was 12 then, all gangly limbs and curiosity with her mama's stubborn streak. We'd picked the Davidson River campground in Pisgah because we knew it well, close enough to town, but deep enough in the forest to feel properly away. We arrived Friday afternoon, September 10th, 2011. The campground wasn't crowded, just a few other sites occupied. We claimed our usual spot near the river bend, where the water made that soothing, rushing sound all night. I remember joking with Abby that the date tomorrow would be 9/11/11, all ones and nines, and she rolled her eyes like pre-teens do when their dads try to sound interesting. Setting up camp followed our usual routine. I handled the tent while Abby gathered kindling. We grilled hot dogs for dinner, made s'mores, and Abby insisted on telling ghost stories, even though they always gave her nightmares. I remember her last story was about something she called the White Walker, from that fantasy show she wasn't supposed to watch at her friend's house. "It's not really scary, Dad," she had said. "They're just these tall white things that live in the snow." The irony of that still makes my skin crawl. We turned in around 10, zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags. The temperature had dropped into the mid-50s, and the forest was alive with its nighttime symphony. Crickets, frogs from the river, the occasional hoot of an owl. Normal sounds, safe sounds. I fell asleep quickly, but woke suddenly at what my watch said was 12:52 a.m. My bladder was full, and I knew from experience I wouldn't get back to sleep until I emptied it. I lay there for a few minutes, debating whether to hold it till morning, when Abby stirred beside me. "Dad," she whispered, "I need to go to the bathroom." "Me too, kiddo," I admitted. "Guess we shouldn't have had those second cups of hot chocolate." The bathrooms were about 50 yards from our campsite, just a simple cinder block building with toilets and sinks. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. The night air hit my face, colder than before. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light that I almost didn't need the flashlight. "Stay close," I told Abby as she climbed out behind me. That's when I heard it, a soft, rustling sound from the trees behind our tent. I swung the flashlight in that direction, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a deer. What I saw instead stopped my heart. Standing beside a tall pine tree was something. My mind scrambled to categorize it, to fit it into any box of normal woodland creatures. But there was nothing normal about it. It was massive. The pine tree it stood beside was one I'd noticed earlier, a straight, mature trunk that I'd guessed was 30 feet tall. This being reached nearly a third of the way up it, 8, maybe 9 feet tall, and it was standing on 2 legs, but its height wasn't what made my breath catch. It was its color, pure white, not the dull, grayish white of a polar bear, but a stark, almost luminous white that seemed to catch and hold the moonlight filtering through the canopy. Its entire body was covered in thick fur that moved slightly in the gentle night breeze. My flashlight beam found its face, and I immediately wished it hadn't. The face was wrong, not quite human, not quite animal. A broad, flattened nose sat above a mouth that seemed too wide, but it was the eyes that held me, deep set under a prominent brow ridge. In the flashlight's glare, I couldn't make out their color, just dark pools staring directly at us. The creature didn't move. It just watched. I felt Abby's hand clutch mine, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "Dad," she whispered so quietly I barely heard her. "Dad, what is that?" I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up. Every instinct screamed to run, but my muscles had locked in place. The creature and I stared at each other for what felt like hours, but must have been only seconds. Then Abby tugged my hand, harder this time, and something broke inside me. Without turning away from the white figure, I slowly stepped backward, pulling Abby with me. "Back to the tent," I whispered, slow and quiet. We inched backward, step by excruciating step. The white creature remained motionless, just watching us retreat. When my heel hit the edge of our tent's ground sheet, I fumbled behind me for the zippered entrance, never taking my eyes off the thing by the trees. "Get in," I told Abby, and she scrambled inside. I followed, moving backward through the opening, then yanked the zipper closed with shaking hands. Only then did I click off the flashlight. The darkness inside the tent felt like a physical weight. I could hear Abby's breathing, fast and shallow. "Dad, what was that?" she asked again, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. "It looked like what, Abby?" "Like Bigfoot, but white." The word hung between us. Bigfoot, the legendary creature I'd always dismissed as nonsense, right up there with the Loch Ness monster and alien abductions. "Did you see how tall it was?" I whispered. "Yes." Her voice was tiny in the darkness. It was as tall as Mrs. Peterson's pine tree in the front yard. That was our reference point at home, the tallest tree on our street, one I'd estimated at 30 feet. Abby was seeing the same thing I had. "I need to pee really bad," she whispered after a moment. "Me too, kiddo, but we're staying put." All night. All night. We sat in silence for several minutes, straining to hear any sound from outside. Finally, there came another rustling from the direction where we'd seen the creature. Then footsteps, heavy but surprisingly quiet for something so large. "It's moving," Abby whispered unnecessarily. The footsteps circled our campsite, never coming too close to the tent, but never moving far away either. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I should call someone, but who? The ranger station would be closed, 911, and tell them what? That we'd seen an albino Bigfoot. They'd think it was a prank call. I put the phone down. We'd wait until morning. "Try to sleep," I told Abby, though I knew neither of us would. "Can I come into your sleeping bag?" she asked, and the fear in her voice broke my heart. She hadn't asked to sleep with me since she was 7. Of course. She slid in beside me, her small body shivering despite the warmth of the sleeping bag. I put my arm around her, holding her close like I used to when she was little and scared of thunderstorms. Throughout the night, we heard the creature moving around our campsite. Sometimes the footsteps would fade, as if it had moved deeper into the forest, only to return half an hour later. Around 3 a.m., dogs started barking from the direction of the ranger's cabin, about a quarter-mile away. "It's over there now," Abby whispered. "Sounds like it." The dogs know it's not normal. I nodded in the darkness, then realized she couldn't see me. "Yeah. Do you think it'll come back?" "I don't know, honey." Neither of us slept. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us tensing, waiting for the tent wall to be ripped away by massive white hands. My bladder was screaming for relief, but there was no way I was setting foot outside that tent until daylight. Dawn came with excruciating slowness. First just a lightening of the darkness, then gradually the shapes inside the tent becoming visible. Birds began their morning calls. Always a good sign. Animals don't sing when predators are near. When the first ray of sunlight hit our tent, I cautiously unzipped the door a few inches and peered out. The campsite looked normal. No massive white creature standing among the trees. "I think it's gone," I told Abby. We both needed the bathroom desperately. I stepped out first, scanning the area carefully. The morning air was cool and damp with dew. Everything looked exactly as it should. Our camp table with the remains of last night's dinner, the fire pit with its cold ashes, the surrounding pines standing silent witness. "Come on," I said to Abby. "Let's go to the bathroom, then pack up." "We're leaving?" She sounded relieved. "Yeah, I think we've had enough camping for this trip." We hurried to the bathroom block, both of us constantly looking over our shoulders. The relief of emptying my bladder was almost painful after holding it all night. When we returned to the campsite, I noticed something I'd missed on our hurried trip to the bathroom, tracks in the soft earth near where we'd seen the creature. They were footprints, but not human. Too large, too wide, with what looked like 5 toes splayed wider than any human foot I'd ever seen. I pulled out my phone and took several pictures, using my hand in the frame for scale. The prints were easily twice the size of my spread hand. "Dad, look." Abby was pointing to the pine tree where we'd first spotted the creature. Caught in the rough bark about 8 feet up was a tuft of white fur. I stepped closer, reaching up to touch it. The fur was coarse but soft, like a dog's winter coat, but thicker. I carefully plucked it from the bark and placed it in a Ziploc bag from our food supplies. "Why are you keeping that?" Abby asked. "Evidence," I replied, though I wasn't sure what I intended to do with it. We packed up in record time, skipping breakfast in our hurry to get back to the safety of our truck. As we were loading the last bag, a park ranger drove by on his morning rounds. He stopped when he saw us breaking camp so early. "Everything all right, folks?" he asked, climbing out of his green National Forest Service truck. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to show him the footprints, the white fur, tell him what we'd seen, but another part, the part that understood how crazy our story would sound, held me back. "Just heading home a bit early," I said. "Got some things to take care of in town." The ranger nodded, seeming to accept this. Then he glanced around our campsite with a slight frown. "You folks hear anything unusual last night?" My heart jumped. "Like what?" "Well, the dogs at the ranger cabin were going crazy around 3 this morning. Then we got calls from 2 other campers about strange noises in the woods." I looked at Abby, who was watching me with wide eyes. "Turn to the ranger," I asked. "What kind of noises?" He shrugged. "One guy said it sounded like heavy footsteps. Another thought it might be a bear, but said it was walking on 2 legs, which bears don't typically do for long distances." He chuckled. "Probably just a deer. They can sound bigger than they are in the dark." I nodded, still uncertain whether to share our experience. Before I could decide, Abby spoke up. "We saw something," she said. "Something big and white." The ranger's expression changed, his casual smile fading. "White, you say?" I found myself nodding. "Yeah, tall, 8, maybe 9 feet, standing right over there." I pointed to the pine with the bark I'd taken the fur from. The ranger stared at the tree for a long moment, then back at us. His face had gone carefully blank, but I could see something in his eyes. Not disbelief, but something almost like recognition. "You're not the first," he said finally, his voice lower than before. 3 reports in the last year, all describing the same thing, huge, white, walking on 2 legs. "Bigfoot?" Abby asked. The ranger glanced at her, then back to me. "We don't use that term officially, but unofficially, the Cherokee have stories about a tall white being in these mountains going back hundreds of years. They call it Sul Kalu, the slant-eyed giant, usually described as having a sloped forehead and white fur." My skin prickled. "You believe in this thing?" He shrugged. 20 years in these woods, I've seen things I can't explain, things that don't fit neatly into biological categories." "We have evidence," I said suddenly, and reached for the Ziploc bag with the white fur. I also showed him the footprint photos on my phone. He examined both carefully. his expression giving nothing away. "Mind if I keep this fur sample? I can send it to some colleagues for analysis." I hesitated, then handed it over. "What will they find?" "Probably that it's from some known animal with unusual coloration. That's the official answer I'd expect." He pocketed the bag. "Unofficially, we've had 3 other samples submitted in the past decade. All came back inconclusive. Hair structure not matching any known species in the database." He handed me his card. "My name's Mike Tanner. If you think of anything else, or if you ever see it again, call me directly. Not the ranger station, me." "You think we will?" "See it again." Ranger Tanner looked out at the forest, his gaze scanning the tree line. "The thing about these encounters, they rarely happen just once. It's like once you've seen it, it knows you, and it gets curious." A chill ran through me. "That's not comforting." "Wasn't meant to be." He turned back to us. "But for what it's worth, in all the reports I've collected, it's never harmed anyone. Scared the hell out of them, sure, but no attacks." That was small comfort as we drove home, both of us quiet, processing what had happened. Abby broke the silence as we turned onto the highway toward Brevard. "Dad, are we going camping next month?" I glanced at her, saw the mix of fear and determination on her face, and felt a surge of pride. My girl was scared, but facing it head on. "Yeah," I said, "but maybe not Davidson River." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this compromise. "Do you think it's still watching us?" I looked in the rearview mirror at the receding forest behind us. For a moment I thought I saw something white move among the distant trees, but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. "I don't know, Abby," I admitted, "but if it is, we'll face it together." The thing is, I meant it when I said that, but in the quiet moments since, when I'm alone in the hardware store after closing, or when I wake at 3 a.m. for no reason, I find myself drawn to the window, peering out at the tree line behind our house, watching for something white moving in the darkness, something that might be watching me back. Because deep down, I know Ranger Tanner was right. Once you've seen it, you're marked somehow, and sooner or later, the White Watcher will come again.